8:32. Let's see. Dan, would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, thank you. I guess we shall begin right away with our first. You'll have to excuse me for a moment because I'm having some problems here with my computer.
Oops. Sorry about that.
Catherine, did you see we have Jim here now too? He joined
Yeah.
us. Yeah.
Great.
Just a moment, I have a guest coming into the meeting. I need to identify this guest. Guest calling in from 925-548-5358. Can you please state your name?
Hi, Dirk Adamson from Siegel.
Oh, hi, Dirk. I'm going to move
Hi.
you back to the waiting room, okay?
Sure.
We're not quite ready for you yet. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Is there any public comment? Do we have anything, Judy, as far as public comment?
For the record, there is no public comment this morning.
Okay. So then we will move on to our first discussion and possible action regarding Resolution 2020-13. And I will turn this over to our Executive Director, Doris Rentschler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe our fiduciary attorney is in the process of being entered into the meeting. However, I can run through a brief summary. She would be here to answer specific questions if necessary. So Resolution 2020-13 is a ratifying resolution regarding implementation of the voluntary correction plan. During the installation of the pension administration system, MSERA became aware of a couple of issues and undertook a benefit review project. The result of that historical benefit review project resulted in a filing for voluntary correction with the Internal Revenue Service to correct certain errors discovered during that process. So the attached resolution incorporates recommendations from MSERA's Fiduciary Council and Tax Council with respect to the matters outlined. The program is that we will make prospective correction to retirees' benefits. Where retirees have been underpaid, MSERA will also provide a lump sum payment covering at least 3 years of the underpayment plus interest if the member has been retired for at least 3 years. And where members were overpaid, MSERA has decided, due to the systemic nature and for fiduciary and equitable reasons, not to seek recovery of the overpayment directly from the member, unless to do so directed by the IRS or a court order. MSERA will be made whole through payments from participating employers as part of their UAAL corrections. And I would like to note here that the employer contribution rates already reflect the fact that overpayments occurred, and our UAAL is reflective of these costs. There won't be an additional added item related to this. The accounting for it is simply to account for it for the internal revenue purposes, but it won't be actually adding an additional item to the unfunded liability because the unfunded liability has already incorporated those costs due to the lower asset value from the overpayments. Did you have any questions? Staff recommends adoption of Resolution 2020-13 as presented.
Is there a motion?
I would move to approve the resolution as presented.
I'll second.
Is there discussion on the motion? Richard, you're muted.
I understand the work that's gone into this process and the seriousness of it all. I have never supported the concept that retirees that were underpaid will not be fully reconciled. And I guess the question is, so Tim is still an official voting member? Okay. I just want to voice that opinion that I think that part of this is not a good end, but I understand we need to get through this.
Is there any further? Yes, Kathy?
I just want to know an update on communication about letters being sent.
Thank you, Trustee Smith. MSARA will be sending project notices to all retired members. There are 2 notices. Approximately 1,000 members, or 2/3 of our retirees, will receive a notice indicating that the review found no issue with their benefit. They are not impacted by this. The other roughly 1/3 of retirees will receive a notice indicating that we are in the process of completing a review or recalculation of their benefit, and will then provide them with a correction notice regarding the specifics to their case.
Is there any further discussion? Okay, if we could have a roll call vote, all those in favor?
I'll take a roll call, please. Ms. Shatmeyer,
Yes.
Ms. Forrester,
Yes.
Ms. Cavanis,
Yes.
Mr. Parker is absent. Ms. Smith,
Yes.
Mr. Cromer,
Aye.
Mr. Knudsen,
Yes.
Ms. Harris is absent. And Supervisor Jurdy,
Yes.
approved.
Okay, motion passes. So we will move on to agenda item number 2, discussion and possible action regarding resolution 2020-14.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Resolution 2020-14 is a clarifying resolution, simply ratifying MSARA's past and current practices regarding some specific items.
I would move to approve.
Thank you.
I will
There-
second.
Any discussion on the motion? Judy, would you please take a roll call vote for us? All those in favor?
Ms. Shatmeyer,
Yes.
Ms. Forrester,
Yes.
Ms. Cavanis,
Yes.
Ms. Smith,
Sorry. Yes.
thank you. Mr. Cromer,
Aye.
Mr. Knudsen,
Yes.
and Mr. Jurdy.
Yes.
Thank you. Approved.
Okay, motion passes. Our next agenda item is discussion and possible action regarding the June 30th, 2020 actuarial evaluation study.
Catherine, we'll say goodbye to Ashley. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you very much. Good to
Thank
see
you.
you all.
Thank you.
The actuarial valuation study. Andy Young?
Good morning, Andy. Can you hear us?
Yes, loud and clear.
Great.
Thank you. Good morning.
Morning,
Good
Andy.
morning. Good morning, Dirk. Thank you for your patience.
All right, sure.
Okay, Andy, are you ready to do exactly, you're doing a presentation on our actuarial valuation study?
Yes, Madam Chair. Yes. Okay. So I don't know. Good morning, Madam Chair and other members of the board. My name is Andy Yang, here with Dirk Adamson to present to you actually two reports. As agendized, the first item is to go through the actuarial valuation as of June 30, 2020, setting contribution rates for the 2020-21 fiscal year. I'm sorry, I misspoke, for the 21-22 fiscal year. I have the valuation report on my desktop. And with that, I would just ask to see if I can share my screen. I think I can grant it that access. Let me see if I can do that. Okay, let's share. Computer is a little slow. So can you see, I'm going to go all the way back to the front of the report. And can you see the valuation report, the cover of the report, Mendocino County Employees Retirement Association Actuarial Valuation Review as of June 30, 2020?
Yes, we can see it, Andy.
Okay, thank you. So as is always the case, I will try to go through the highlight sections of the report, and of course I will announce the page numbers just in case any audience is following via audio only. The purpose of the valuation, and by the way, I'm now on page 5 of the report. This page of the report is pretty much boilerplate. However, there are a couple of very significant items that have transpired since the last valuation that I want to remind the board, and I'm sure that the board will remember. Paul Angelo and myself were in front of your board actually 2 times earlier this year. At the June board meeting, he and I presented the actuarial experience study, the triennial experience studies. As is the practice and the policy of the board, you ask the actuary, direct the actuary to conduct an experience study every 3 years. Included in the review of the assumptions, of course, are the interest rate assumption, inflation assumption, and mortality assumption, retirement rate assumptions, and things like of that nature. In that last experience study that we conduct at the June meeting, there were some very significant changes in those assumptions that we have incorporated for the first time in this valuation. So this would be the first valuation, 2020, which we use those assumptions, and those assumptions again will be applied unless directed by the board in the 2021 and 2022 valuations. So because of that 3-year process to review and update the assumptions, they have some cost ramifications. So there's going to be a page in the report that I'm going to spend a fair amount of time with you later today, going through what those cost ramifications are, not just with respect to the most recent experience study, but also the last several experience studies. So questions in no doubt would raise in the minds of the board as to how come the employer is making the contribution as expected and as requested by the retirement board, and how come the unfunded liability keeps going up. And so that really has something to do with the fact that we are changing and making the assumptions more conservative and therefore increasing the cost in the interim. So with that as a backdrop, I'm now going to go to page 7 of the report. In this valuation, we measure first and foremost with respect to the amount of unfunded liability we have in the plan, how much do we have in that unfunded liability, and how do we compare when we measure the liability with the assets in the plan. So as you can see on the first bullet point item, there was actually reduction in the funded status. So last year when we did the valuation using the old actuarial assumptions, the funded status was 70.6%. So in layman's term, this is to answer the question: for every dollar worth of liability that we have in the plan, how much assets we have to cover that liability? So the answer from last year's valuation was about 70.6 cents per dollar worth of liability. So this year, the number has gone down to 69.3%. And again, we will go through a page in the report, which will show you how come there's an increase in that amount of the unfunded liability. But before we do that, let me try to summarize the assumption changes that I was alluding to a couple of minutes ago. That increased the unfunded liability of the plan by about $150 million, and that increased the contribution rate. As you can see, the pointer that I have on the screen increased the employer's rate by almost 2.7% of payroll, and it also increased the employees' contribution rate, our members' contribution rate, by about 0.93% of payroll. When we did the experience study back in June, there were really two set of very major assumptions that we have taken a look at and recommend, and the board will approve our recommendation to revise. First and foremost, it's good news for our employees and our retirees, because salary increases that we have observed during the last 3 experience studies have actually gone up. So as a result, we have recommended a higher salary increase assumption. We call that the merit and promotional salary increases assumptions. And as a matter of fact, that some of the board members will remember when I was presenting to you the report, the valuation report last year, several of you were very quick to remind Seagull that for a very long time, our active members have not been able to receive salary increases commensurate with what our other neighboring counties have received. And there were some salary scale, salary survey studies that were conducted. So I think you kind of forewarned the actuary be expected to see some salary increases greater than expected. And of course, that has shown up in the data that we used for the last experience study. And as a matter of fact, when we go through the reconciliation of the unfunded liability and contribution rate, you will see another year of, again, good experience for the active members, because they're getting salary increase still higher than expected by the old actuarial assumptions that we set in the last valuation. So I want to, again, if you ask me to, well, take out my crystal ball and anticipate what's going to happen, I would also anticipate in the next valuation, when we show up and present to you the June 30, 2021 valuation in November of next year, I do expect to see some salary losses again for the plan and salary gains higher than expected for our active members. Because again, the salary increases that the county has agreed to with the bargaining parties is a multi-year arrangement. So it's not just last year, not just this year, it's also going to be something showing up next year. So suffice to say that there was a change in the assumptions to anticipate at least some of those, and that increased the contribution rate as part of the experience study. Now, the other part of the assumption change, which again is good for our retirees, but increases the cost of the plan, is to anticipate that our retirees are living longer. So between the almost 2.7% rate impact for the employer and almost the 0.9% rate impact for the employee, roughly half of those salary, of roughly half of the payroll cost increase are due to the merit and promotional salary increase adjustment, and the other half is for the mortality. So we also look at the investment return assumption. In the last valuation, June 30, 2019, we were assuming an assumption of 7%. We recommend and the board approve our recommendation to reduce that to 6.75. So in this case, for this assumption change, it really have very little cost impact. And the reason why that is the case is at the same time when we recommend a lowering of the investment return assumption, we make a recommendation to also lower the inflation component. So that inflation assumption went down from 3 to 2.75%, which affects both the salary increase, affects the COLA that we expect our retirees to get. So on the net basis, there's very little impact because of the change in the economic assumption. So it's almost like a review. So bottom line is, and I think it is still very important though, is most of the cost increase that you will see later this morning in our valuation report really has to do with the fact that the board has agreed to our recommendation to change and to adopt a set of more conservative mortality and salary increase assumption. So that caused the contribution rate to go up and explain the bulk of the the payroll increase for the employer, and it almost explained the entire cost increase for the employees, for our members. So with that, I'll just pause, because even though it's just a review, but I think it is very important as we go through the rest of the report, because this is really the reason, the change in the assumption, something that we expect going in. And I think you might remember Paul and I said at the last meeting, so no good deeds would go unpunished. Anytime the board authorized Seagull to apply a set of more conservative, you can call them more realistic actuarial assumptions, that will immediately increase the contribution rate requirement, not just for our employer, but also for our members. And it would cause the funding status, when measured using the liabilities and measured using those more conservative assumptions, to appear to be bigger. So that's really the reason why, in a nutshell, why the contribution rate, the unfunded liability is changing in this year's valuation. So with that, I just pause before I flip through a couple of pages explaining to you how the unfunded liability and how the contribution rate changes during the year. Okay, so it sounds like there are no questions, so I will then continue to move forward. So at this point, I will go to the third bullet point item, so which explain the increase in the unfunded liability for the plan from $219 million calculated in the 2019 valuation to the $244 million calculated in the 2020 in the current valuation. So with that, I will now go to page 29 of our report, because we have a handy summary which actually goes through and explain how that unfunded liability changes from last year to this year. In the beginning of the year, the amount of the unfunded liability was about $219 million. Now, if all the actuarial assumptions were to be met, the amount of the unfunded liability would have come down to about $217 million. Again, the board may remember the reason why, even though it's very burdensome for our employers to pay not just the normal cost, but also the unfunded liability, which is geared towards paying off the UAAL for the plan. But yet, after all those efforts, the amount of the unfunded liability has only gone down, in air quotes, only by $2 million. And the reason why that is the case is when we develop the UAAL contribution rate requirement, which we will see on the page that I'm going to show you in the next minute, when we actually look at the UAAL, they are paid in layers. As a matter of fact, back many years ago when we first were appointed as the actuary for the account, right before that, I think the board has, some of the board members may remember, you have decided to re-amortize the amount of the unfunded. So by re-amortizing, it's almost like the same as going to the bank and basically rearranging with the bank to basically take the mortgage on the pension plan, on the mortgage on our houses, and basically refi that over a longer period. I think in that case was about 30 years. So in the process of doing that, it temporarily relieved the contribution rate requirement for the employer because it would be make lower anytime we refinance. But it also means that in the first several years, when the unfunded liability is being paid off, there's very little interest that is paid. As a matter of fact, for the type of amortization that we do, we call it the level percentage of payroll amortization. There's really no interest that is, no principal that is paid. So we continue to have to pay interest currently at the assumed rate of 7% based on the last valuation, but the contribution coming in is really not enough to cover the interest. But that has changed, so as you will see in the next several minutes. So bottom line is the amount of the unfunded liability has gone down from slightly from 219 to only $217 million. So that's assuming that all the assumptions were to be met. And in this case, not all the assumptions have been met. And the first item that I want to point out would be the experience study. So again, it's due to the fact that the board has approved Seagull's recommendation to increase the merit and promotion salary increase assumption, really to reflect the salary survey and the other agreements between the bargaining parties and the county in this case. So this increased the liability as well as the mortality assumptions by about $15 million. So in this valuation, and as some of the board members may recall, when we do the valuation, we were taking a snapshot, in particular, not just the membership data, but of the financial results as of June 30, 2020. So 2020 was not like any year that I can remember. The board may remember any years that you may remember. We have gone through a roller coaster ride in the capital market. So I think the investments were quite horrible towards the end of March of 2020. I think they recovered some at June of 2020, and I think some of the values have gone up even more since June 30, 2020. However, for this particular valuation, everything was done based on a snapshot date as of June 30, 2020. So as a result, in this valuation, we have used the market value provided by your staff, and as of that date, and depending on whether or not it's a calculation that we do or a calculation that you got from your investment consultant, they tend to be very close, but they're not exactly the same. But at least the rate of return that we calculate on the market value basis was 2.8%. So this actually is maybe the third of the fourth valuations that Dirk and I have delivered based on the June 30, 2020 valuation date. So we observed that a lot of our clients have rates of return which are very closely in the 2 to 3% range. So you are at 2.8%, so a little bit at the high end of the range, according to the first small sample, small size number of valuations that we have delivered. But nonetheless, the 2.8% on the market value basis, even after this going through this so-called asset smoothing method. So the way it works is we don't use the market value, because if we have to use market value to set your contribution rate, the rate can actually fluctuate quite a bit. But in this case, we use a smooth value of assets. So we actually take the 2.8% market return, and we actually compare that to the assumed rate of 7% still from the 19 valuation, and then we defer 80% of those losses. So after everything is said and done, the rate of return is a little bit closer to the 7 that we expect the fund to earn in 2020, but it still come in at 6.2%. So it is that fact that the market returns are lower, even after going through the smoothing, the rate of returns are lower, and so that's the reason why we have a loss due to the fund not earning the assumed rate of 7%, based on the benchmark that we set for our 2019 valuation. I have already talked about the fact that our active members are continuing to get salary increases higher than expected. So again, this is my understanding is this is a multi-year agreement between the employer and the bargaining parties. So last year, I think the salary loss was about $5 million. So this year is coming in about $6 million. There's a 1 year delay between the rate that we calculate in the last valuation and when they're paid by the employer. So every year we do expect to see a little bit of a actuarial gains and loss. I think this year is a loss. Last year was a gain. And there are some other experience items. So as you can see in the footnote that we have on the bottom of this page, most of this actuarial experience loss really has to do with the fact that we did put in a change in the method that we use to anticipate how much our retirees and actually the beneficiaries that will get corresponding to those members who get the Social Security level income option. So again, just some refinement change that we put in. But the bottom line is, if I have to boil it down to exactly why the unfunded liability in the plan has gone up by $26 million, over half of that is due to the assumption changes that Paul and I alert the board when you agree to approve our recommended assumptions changes for the experience study. And the other half, maybe 20% or so is due to higher than expected salary increase. Again, something that is not too surprising. The other part has to do with the investment experience. So this is the story on the change in the unfunded liability. So maybe with that, I'll just ask to see if there are any questions before I take you through a very similar looking page, except that we will be looking at the contribution rate impact on the employer as well as on the employees. Okay. So not hearing any questions, so I will continue to proceed. So I will now turn to page 31 of our valuation report. So this is the page where we have taken the contribution rate that we calculate in the last valuation, which is about 34.2%, or about $25 million. Now, of course, we'll be quick to remind the board, as we have done in the past, is that the 34.2% is really an average rate. So this is a rate taking into account the contribution rate that we have calculated in the last year's valuation for all of our general, safety, and probation membership classes, and the rates are actually different between the different tiers. So this is really just a average based on the payroll that we have been provided with for the current valuation, and applying that to the contribution rate that we calculate for each and every membership categories, as well as the tiers. And then and after we apply that, the weighted average is about 34% of payroll. For this year's valuation, I think you can see most of the items that we were talking about a few minutes ago on the unfunded liability. They are actually represented again on this page. So for example, the one item that would jump right out at everybody would be the impact of the assumption changes. So in this case, the assumption change, the impact is about 2.7% of payroll. I think when we were presenting the experience study, we said it's about 2.5%, so it's coming in pretty close. So besides the assumption change, we also talk about the impact of investment returns coming in less than expected by the actuarial assumption. So that caused the contribution rate to go up by 0.4% of payroll. And there's also the impact of the salary increases of our active members coming in still higher than the actuarial assumptions before the most recent experience study. Now, the one item that you don't see has to do with the effect of amortizing the prior year's UAL over the larger than expected payroll base. So the way the valuation works is anytime, again, when we have an unfunded liability, the amount of that unfunded liability is then taken and expressed as a percentage of payroll. So in the case of individual employees, if they are getting salary increases which are higher than expected than the assumption, this will generally cause the contribution rate to go up. On the other hand, because we have now a bigger payroll base from all of our employers, including the county, we can now take the unfunded liability from last year and basically spread it over a bigger payroll base in determining the contribution rate. So I think in this year's valuation, we saw it's on a page that I'm not going to go to, page 12. We saw that the total payroll base has actually gone up on a very robust 5.9% of payroll, whereas we only expect that payroll to increase by 3.5%. So as a result, we have taken the last year's unfunded liability and spread it over a bigger payroll. So that has a dampened effect on the contribution rate requirements. But the bottom line, as you can see, is after all the transactions are taken into account, all the changes are taken into account, the contribution rate is going up by about 3.4% of payroll. The majority of that impact is due to the assumption changes that we recommend and the board approved at the June meeting. So that caused the contribution rate to go up by about 2.7%. The rest are due to investment losses and salary increases greater than expected, as well as for some other minor reasons. So that's the picture on the employer. The employer's rate as a result of this valuation has gone up by about 3.4% of payroll. In dollar terms, we are looking at about $2.5 million. And then on the members' rate, the impact is really primarily due to the change in the actuarial assumptions. So again, on a weighted average basis, the contribution rate that all of our members pay is about 9% of payroll. In dollar terms, about $7 million. The contribution rate is going up by pretty close to 1% of payroll in total. But most of that is due to the assumption changes, and again, due to the two factors that I was talking about, the mortality table changes, as well as the changes in salary increase assumption. So that's why on page 32 of our report, you will see that there's a pretty robust increase in the contribution rate for the employees, but most of that is really due to the changes in the actuarial assumptions. Now, some board members may remember the reason why there are a lot fewer items whenever we reconcile the members' contribution rate on page 32 compared to page 31. That really has to do with the fact that our members, according to the 37 Act, of course, is only responsible for any changes in the normal cost rate. But any changes in the unfunded liability rate are really paid for by the employer. So that's why if investments are coming in less than expected returns, or salary increases are coming in higher than expected, that burden of the contribution rate, especially on the unfunded liability, are basically paid for by the employer. Okay, so those are the reconciliation of the employer's rate. Now I'm going to go through the amortization schedule next, but I'll just pause to see if there are any questions on the rate reconciliation, because I know that by this time we have already gone through the first, I think, 5 bullet points in the summaries highlight, valuation highlight section of the report. But let me pause to see if there are any questions before I try to go through the unfunded liability pages where we show the board how the total unfunded liability of well over $200 million that we have accumulated in the plan actually came about.
Andy, it's Jerry Harris. I just want to tell you I'm here, and it wasn't at roll call, couldn't get in, but I'm right along with you on the report.
Thank you, Trustee Harris. Okay.
Chair, I have a question. Andy, are you going to go over the specific contributions by the different member groups?
Yes, I will do that, yes.
Okay, because I just have one question on that, but go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Now, I can either do that now, or I can just go through the unfunded liability schedules first and then come back to the rate, whatever is the pleasure of the trustees and the board, rest of the board.
I would say go ahead with your normal.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So I will now turn to just the amortization schedule. So I'm now going to page 72 of the report. So we do have actually in the report starting on page 71 a table that looks like this for each of the general, the safety, and then on the top of page 72, the probation classifications. So for the plan as a whole, you remember I talked about a total unfunded liability of $244 million. And then the payments that we have on the unfunded liability currently is about, the payment is about $19 million. Now, if we look at the history of the unfunded liability and see how each and every amount of unfunded liability came about, you will notice that, and I said early on, that the experience study, especially with the assumption changes that we have been recommending to the board, have been maybe one of the primary reasons why the UAL has been going up. So for example, in the most recent experience study, I mentioned early on that there's an unfunded liability added for $15 million. At the time of the last experience study back in before the 2017 valuation, the unfunded liability that was added as a result of that experience study was $27 million. And then for the experience study, which preceded that, was $52 million. Now, there were a lot of assumptions that we changed, but the one that really may catch the attention of the board would be the change in the investment return assumptions. So as a matter of fact, even though back in the day, before the 2012 valuation, the board used to have a practice where all the unfunded liability would be rolled in or basically combined and amortized in a single layer. So that's why you don't see any amounts prior to 2012. But when I go back and look at the 2011 valuation, so that was the first experience study that actually we did prior to that valuation, that added an unfunded liability of $24 million. So if I take that $24 million that I collect from the 2011 experience study, add to that the $52 million from the 2014 experience study, add to that the $27 million and the $15 million, all that amounts combined together made up well over one half of the $244 million. So in other words, with respect to the unfunded liability that have actually been recorded and basically been recognized as part of the schedule here, well over one half of the $244 million was due to the assumption changes. So that really leaves us with about $120 million that more or less is due to the combined base layer. That's the kind of the black box that we really cannot see is due to all the changes that took place prior to 2012. So again, this is the story on the no good deeds will go unpunished. Anytime we recommend and you change the assumptions, that has ramification, and in this case, it has caused the unfunded liability to go up. But in a nutshell, during the last 10 years, the one thing that has happened is that the investment return assumption in particular has gone down from, in the 2011 experience study, it was back then at 7.75%. It was reduced to 7.25% in the 2014 experience study, and then it went down to 7% in the 2017 experience study, and then now today, going forward, we're now at 6.75%. So even though investment return assumption is not the only assumption change that caused the UAL to go up, but it is by far the most important. So there are also other changes that we recommend, in particular the adoption of a public sector mortality table. So that's the reason why the UAL for the plan has gone up, is because of the assumption changes. There are other factors, but they more or less cancel off each other. And then there's the original unfunded liability. So right now, if you may remember, I said that we're writing down on a amortization schedule, which is now for the original base. So the original base was set at $126 million. It was amortized over 27 years. Right now it's down to about 19 years. The one good thing about the current board policy is that once we get into a point where the amortization policy drops below maybe about 20 or 19 years, that is when we would be asking the employer to pay us a UAL contribution, which would be at least sufficient to pay down the interest on those UAL. So because if you take the $9 million in payment divided by $134 million for this combined base, that amount is 7.25%. So which is at least greater than the 6.75% interest that we are calculating today. So likewise, for each and every one of these layers down below, they are sufficient to pay down the interest. So the reason why this is so important, especially for a plan which is in the process of paying down the UAL, is because if you look at the graph on page 73, you notice that with respect to $244 million in unfunded liability we have in the plan today, and when you track to see how much in net UAL will materialize if all the actuarial assumptions were to be met from now on, which of course is a very major, big assumption. But if that were to be the case, then you will see that the UAL will continue to be paid down over time. Now, it's not going to be paid down very quickly, only because the longest layer of amortization that we still have is with respect to this red restart layer. So until the red restart layer is paid off, which is not until year 2031, will the plan, or 2038, I apologize, will you expect to see really when the plan becomes fully funded? And by the similar token, when you look at the contribution payments to the UAL, which we show on page 74, you will see that the employer's contribution rate will continue to go up. And the reason why it's going up is because of the fact that we are taking a level percentage of payroll amortization right now, assuming that payroll is going to increase at the assumed rate of 3.25% in total each year. So the fact that the UAL contributions are going up, it is because of that 3.25% escalating factor each and every year. However, when the UAL, some of the layers drop off, then the UAL payments will drop off, but the bulk of the UAL payment would not be expected to drop off until, again, that very relatively longer UAL payments from the restart layer would be paid off. So that's why for our plan, you would, when we ask the question, so how long will it take for the employer to be relieved of the UAL payment? In our case, the answer is it's going to take a good 19 years, because that's the longest restart layer that we have in the plan. Okay, so any
Mr.
questions?
Young, I have a question. This is Trustee Cromer. So looking at that graph that you're on right now on page 74, we are still continuing to have an assumed increase in payroll of 3.25% in the years to follow, when we know that to be incorrect, and it's likely going to be, at least for one more year, 3 to 5 times higher than that from many bargaining units. Is there going to be any adjustment? Because I saw earlier on the other pages that we're still paying off the fact that we didn't recognize that in the last year.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, Trustee Kuma, but in the case of the funding methodology that we have, what we're trying to do is to come up with a, for the long term, what is expected to be the payroll increases for all the employers combined over a period, not just 1 year, but over the next, in this case, almost 19 years. So in this case, knowing that our members are expected to get another year of salary increases greater than expected, so 2 things will happen. One would be when we take the UAL contribution payments that we see on this page, we would expect to basically, even though the dollar contributions are the same, but when we express it as a percentage of payroll, that payroll rate would be smaller, right? So that's the reason why when we were reconciling the rate for the employer, you see some dampening effect due to that payroll in this year, for example, 5.9% coming in higher than expected. On the other hand, we almost expect this coming if the payroll increases for individual employees, our active members, are coming in higher than expected by the actuarial assumptions, we may see some actuarial losses. So the good thing about this year, the way the numbers work out this year, I'm hoping that will continue to work for next year, is that one will cancel off each other. So even though we are not taking into account that for the next valuation, payroll more than likely is going to come in higher, but I think we would rather do that because we also expect more than likely that there could be some short-term contribution losses because our members during the I think the duration of the current contract, maybe for another year or 2, are going to get the individual salary increase higher than expected. So it's a very long answer to your question. I think we're doing that to, again, follow the board's funding policy to have a UAL rate be developed using a percentage of payroll increase, assuming at 3.25%, with the understanding that if the experience for the plan were to continue, which there's no reason to doubt that, we would expect to see some dampening effect because the UAL rate would go down because we have a bigger payroll base, and hopefully that would be sufficient to offset those salary losses like we have experienced in the last 2 years.
And a follow-up question to that, I appreciate your explanation, but the 3.25% that we assume on that level of the payroll increase, where does that number come from? Is that a nationwide average? Is that a state average? Is it based on our county? Or where do we get that number?
It's actually a number that we developed as part of the experience study. It's made up of 2 components. It's the sum of the inflation assumption, which is 2.75%. And also another 0.5%, which we call an across-the-board pay increases. So it's an assumption that we developed as part of the experience study. It's more of an assumption that I would argue is developed for not just based on the MSERA experience. For example, you may remember when we were in front of the board, when you asked us, how did we come up with the inflation assumption? So 2.75. We said that we actually, CEQA only has one assumption that we apply to all of our clients. So in this case, using the experience, not just from MSERA, but for all of our other clients, that's how we came up with an inflation assumption of 2.75. So likewise, the across-the-board pay increase is, again, it's still a macroeconomic assumptions that we have, again, based on observation of the MSERA experience as well as the experience from other systems. So that's how we came up with the 2. So it's more of a assumption that I would claim that we have looked at as part of the experience study, and part of your experience study in particular, but it's an assumption that we tend to favor and tend to apply and recommend to all of our clients. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your explanation.
Okay. So I think if there are no other questions, I will now go back to the
question.
Okay.
It's Richard Shoemaker. With a little question that Quincy just had, What is the calculation of a percentage of the employees that would get a 5% merit increase? How is that worked into this?
Are you asking me, Richard?
No, I'm actually asking Andy.
Okay.
If you can answer it,
I don't think I can.
Yeah. I think we. So I'm going to now turn to page 80 of our valuation report, because I think that's where the 5% Trustee Shoemaker that you may be referring to. Now, when we develop the salary increase assumptions, those assumptions are developed by using a service base based on service. So what we do is, for example, if I'm looking at our general membership, so even though the 5% is also applicable for our safety and probation members as well, but for those members who are in the first year of the employment, and based on the data that we observe as part of the experience study, from the data for the last 3 and maybe even 6 years, we make the observation that on a very general basis, our active members during the first year of employment are getting salary increases, which are about 5%. Now, I know that this is not always the case, because some members may get higher, some members may get lower. And as a matter of fact, when we apply or adjust the actuarial assumptions, what we try to do is to stay very close to the actual experience. But of course, the actual experience can be quite volatile. Sometimes the experience can tell us that, oh no, our active members are actually getting 6%, or maybe our active members are getting 4.5%. So what we do is we apply some judgment, but in this case, based on the data that we observe, so this is really based on the MSERA experience in particular that we observed during the experience study periods, and based on the judgment we apply, we concluded that it would be appropriate and reasonable to apply an assumption of 5%. So in the valuation, if we have a member who have just been hired by the county, for example, then we assume that going from the first to the second year, he or she is expected to get a salary increase of about 5%. So this is, again, taking the data that we observe and applying some judgment, and the assumption that we pick that we select was 5%. So in reality, some members may get something higher, some members may get something lower. But as you can see, what happened is we continue to believe that service is a better predictor as to level of promotion or level of increases, salary increases our members will get. So that's why even after the first year, even though the level of increase we anticipate dropped from, does not go up from 5%, does not go up at 5%, but it's still 4.5%. So so the level of increases taper off over time so that it would stabilize at about 1%, but only after 10 years. So this is really a combination of members being more efficient, getting promotions, and sometimes they just move from one pay grade to the other. Okay, so if there are no other questions, then now I'm going to go back to the contribution rate pages for the employer, which is on page 33 of the valuation report. So on page 33 is where we provide the contribution rate for each of our general, our safety, as well as for our probation membership classifications. Then with that, maybe I'll see if then I can try to answer your questions.
Well, I do have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you. So just my question is kind of simple. So just to look at section 4, where actual member contributions, and just to kind of keep it simple, looking at the PEPR employees, which have sort of a consolidated contribution rate. If the probation employees have a more generous plan than the general employees, but a slightly less generous plan than the safety employees, if I'm reading this correctly, it looks like the probation employees have a slightly higher contribution rate than the safety employees. I'm just trying to understand why that is.
Oh, okay. Yeah, let me.
And do you know what page that was on as far as section 4?
Okay, sorry. That is pages 112 would be the probation tier 3, and then page 109 would be tier 3 for safety members.
Exactly. Yeah. Now I think we can also pull up, and I'm going to go ahead and pull up page 10, which we have provided a handy summary. Still the same rates that Dan pointed out. For example, at the bottom of the second half of the rate page, we have the probation members rate for our tier 3 probation members at 12.88% of pay. And then for our safety members, tier 3, our pepper members at 11.91% of pay. So it's well observed that the contribution rates are higher than for the probation members compared to the safety. Now, generally speaking, and I'm going to cheat later on by looking at the report, and maybe Dirk can help me take a look at that as well. So generally speaking, our contribution rate are set using this so-called entry age method. So the way this method is supposed to work is that the older the members are when they enter the retirement association and when they enter MSERA, their contribution rate under this entry age method is expected to be higher. And the way it works for retirement plan funding is the longer we have to invest the money paid for by not just the members in this case, but our employers, the more time we would have the money grow with compound interest and whatnot. So in this case, the probation members, generally speaking, enter the retirement plan at a later age, entry age, than our safety members. So Dirk, have you looked up the numbers? Otherwise, I can try to calculate that. So I think I can kind of do that for our. I'm looking at page 51 of the report, which I'm not going to go to, but page 51. We have the demographic profile of our safety members. So when I look at the average age of those members and how many years they have been with the plan, I've calculated a age of entry into MSERA and on an average basis of about 32. So that means that for all the 25 probation members that we have in tier 3, when they enter the plan, they're about 32 years old. However, when I now look at the entry age profile of our safety tier 3 members on page 49 of the report, I also compare the age that they have today as well as the age when they and the years of service. I calculate an average age when they enter the association of 29 years old. So in other words, repeating myself, probation members in the PEPPER plan, they enter the plan at 32, but our safety members in tier 3 PEPPER members, when they enter the plan, they are 29. So even though the age is only different by 3 years, but it is at least in this case sufficient to produce a difference in the entry age of about normal cost rate for very close to 1% of payroll. So again, repeating myself again, the answer as to why our probation members are paying higher rate is because they are on the average about 3 years older when compared to the safety members when they enter the retirement association.
Thank you for the explanation.
Thank you. Okay. So any questions on what I have presented so far? Okay, now if not, I'm going to go back to the front of the report. I know that you have a related discussion early on. So I'm going to now go back at the top of page 8. We like to, as we always do, like to remind the board that because on an investment front, we had a not so great year, and it was return was about 2.8% when compared to the 7% that we were expecting the fund to earn a year ago based on the 2019 valuation. So yet we were able to take some of the investment losses and basically recognize that through the board's funding methodology and smooth it out over a period of 5 years. Now, of course, the bottom line is there's no free lunch. So the fact that we were able to recognize losses later does not mean that losses is not going to have to be recognized. That's of course the case unless the market has rebound, which it has up to a certain point in the current fiscal year we're in. So suffice to say that for full disclosure, as we always do in our report, as of the date of the 2020 valuation, the plan was sitting on some deferred market losses. And if you ask how much, and the answer was $17.7 million. Now, we don't just, by the way, defer the losses. For example, last year we deferred some gains, although the gains was much smaller. It was only $35,000 last year. However, when we have to defer the losses, which amounts to about 3.3% of the market value of assets, that has some consequences unless the fund were to earn something way ahead of the assumed rate of 6.75% in order to make up those losses. So in this case, if those losses were not to be mitigated by other actuarial experience, especially market gains next year, it is going to cause the contribution rate, that average rate that I was talking about for the employer of 37.6, with the need to increase the employer's contribution rate if they were all to be recognized in 1 year to 39%. Now I said if because under the board's funding policy, even if the market losses were not to be mitigated, you would take another 4 more years to recognize those losses, and therefore the contribution rate will not shoot up to 39% in 1 year in the next valuation. But it is important to remind the board that, and remind the employers that the contribution rate, unless there were some market gains has to be at least 3.3%. So in other words, if we expect the fund to earn 6.75%, we have to earn well over 10% in order to, for 1 year anyway, in order to mitigate and to absorb all the market losses. Now, there are other events which we have been talking to your staff about, although in this case, as you are aware, back at the end of June of 2020, the California Supreme Court has rendered a decision in the case of Alameda County Deputy Sheriff's Association against the Alameda County Board of Retirement. For that retirement association, that has some ramification for the need to basically implement the CalPEPR provisions, including what should be or what could be counted as compensation earnable. Now, at least from our conversation with your staff, even though we have not included any of the impact of that particular decision as it applies to MSERA on either the liability or the assets, but it appears from the information that Ms. Rentschler had shared with CEQA at this point that that impact appears to be pretty small, which is good news for the employer and for the board as well. So again, the impact of that decision kind of varies, depends on what action may have been taken by those other retirement boards, but at least it appears, based on our conversation, with preliminary conversation with your retirement administrator, that impact might be very small. But we have not included that as part of this valuation, and we anticipate that it would be not until the 2021 valuation, the next year's valuation, when that impact would be fully reflected. I think with that, I know that, again, we have spent an entire meeting at the July board meeting to go through a so-called actuarial standards of practice, ASOP 51. This is the so-called risk report with the board. So there are, in the full report, a lot of illustration projections that we have included, including the impact of salary increases greater than expected. So we are not going to be repeating that risk report until next time, before right after the next experience study, so which is 3 years from now. So there are some information that we have included in this report to allow us to provide the trustees with some estimates as to what could happen if the actuarial assumptions in this report were not to be materialized. In particular, what happened if investment returns were to come in higher or lower than expected by the actuarial assumptions. So I'm not going to go through that with the board today unless you have any questions.
Andy, could I make a quick comment regarding the Alameda decision impact? When I had discussed that with you previously and we were talking about a relatively small scope, that was just the impact of the changes to the retiree benefits, and the scope of contribution changes due to active and deferred membership that need to be refunded actually isn't in the figures that we had previously discussed. I just want to make sure the board understood that.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Doris, for that clarification. So I think with that, I'm going to repeat our recommendation to the board, which is that you consider and adopt the contribution rate in this report, which is broken down into a lot more detail, a lot of tiers. They were done for the employer by tiers and by membership groups, as well as for our members. They are broken down by entry age, and for the legacy non-pepper tiers, and for at a single rate for our pepper tier members. And so unless there are any questions, I think that concluded our prepared remarks.
Catherine, I think you might be looking for a motion.
I had one question, Andy, if I may, Chair Cavanis.
Yes.
On page 74, the layering of the unfunded liability, the restart layer going out to 2038, I was wondering, I know that was a 30-year amortization, and I was wondering what effect would it be if that time period were be shortened? Right now we have, you said 19 years left.
Right.
I imagine if that was shortened, that would increase the contribution rate. But what if we were to take a more active stance on that? What do you think that taking a year or two, bringing it down to a lower amortization schedule, how would that affect our unfunded and our employer contribution rates? We're not waiting so long to be paid off in our unfunded liability.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a very good question. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the calculation which would be required to answer that question. The way this works out is such that right now there's 19 years left, and because the payment, as is almost the case for our mortgages on our houses, when we go from say 30 years to 20 years, it does not necessarily mean that the contribution rate is going to go up or down proportional to the number of years. I think the calculation involving the level percent to pay amortization is even more convoluted, more difficult to do on the fly. So I apologize for not having the answer ready, but definitely if the board would be interested, we can certainly bring back what would happen if we were to, for example, shorten the amortization period by any number of years that might be of interest to Trustee Forrester. But of course, Trustee Forrester, you're great in pointing out that the no free lunch rule would apply. Also, because you point out increasing contributions, because as great as it would be to help the employers basically pay off the mortgage over a shorter period of time, but that would come at a cost, and the cost, of course, would be to increase the contribution rate right away. Although the upside is it would reduce the interest, right, that the employer is paying towards this loan. Because again, let's be very clear, we have a contribution in developing the contribution rate. Anytime we have an unfunded liability, we charge 6.75% interest on that unfunded liability. So that's why, even though the employer is given another 19 years, the board still be, I think, comfortable in allowing the employer to take that time to make that payment, because every year that the employer has an unfunded liability remaining with the plan, we charge them interest at 6.75%. So we can certainly calculate what could happen if we were to reduce that payment period by a certain number of years. And so we would, so the trade-off would be, how much does that increase the contribution rate? How much does that increase the dollar contribution each year? But how much is that going to save in interest to the employer? So we would be more than happy to take direction from the board to basically provide those calculations.
Thank you. I would be interested in that, but I don't know if the rest of the board would be.
For any other discussion on recalculating?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
Quincy. I would also be interested in that, because from what we went over today and what we've talked about and what's in the report, it doesn't look like it's going to be quite a few years before we're even covering the interest that we're paying on this. So it just feels like we continue to take steps backwards. So I would be interested in those types of calculations to better understand the situation and potential benefit of doing this in a shorter period of time.
Is there any other discussion? Are there any other comments on this?
May I make comment, Madam Chair?
Yes.
Although I'm supportive of wanting to get the unfunded liability paid down sooner, and certainly there are some interest savings to the employer by doing such, by increasing the payment on the UAL over a fewer number of years. I would like to point out that, you know, the county is still not certain of the end result of the tax revenue impact of the COVID-19 issue, and that it may not be necessarily feasible for the county to take additional increase in employer contribution costs to narrow the amortization schedule. And we would want certainly to work with our plan sponsors in regard to that.
This is Sherry. I'd like to just add one thing on this conversation. I think it's an excellent conversation. One thing I think, you know, maybe the timing now, which is what Doris is talking about. The other thing I think we need to consider is that in 5 years, our pension obligation bonds will be paid off. So that will be an $8 million payment that the county is not making. And from what I heard years ago, and I don't know if it's true or not, only about half of that actually hits the general fund. So that's about a $4 million difference. I think that what Julie just brought up, that may be the way to use that money, that $4 million that we're going to be getting extra. That may be a really good, valuable place to put it. I mean, of course, we're not going to have it for some years, and we're still doing that. But that is something I think that the board and the county needs to start thinking about, is what's going to happen when that $8 million debt that we have to pay every year goes away. And, you know, at least half of that is going to be recognized, that money that we'll be able to put towards the debt.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is there a motion to?
Madam Chair.
Yes, Richard Shoemaker.
This is a question for Andy. I think it's a very simple question. We have all kinds of tables on mortality and years when you came into the system. Can you tell us the age of a male or a female that works for Mendocino County, the average death age?
Yeah. Now I know that this is a reasonable question, but the answer is it still kind of depends. I know that we have tables in our experience study report to answer that question. So I apologize for not remembering what those ages are, but I can certainly, I'm sure that you don't have a copy of the report with you. But
yeah, it said 1 year up for women and 1 year down for men.
Yeah.
What's the baseline?
Yeah, so so it's actually on page, Trustee Shoemaker, on page 42 of the report. So for example, I'm looking at very rough terms, even the report that I'm looking at does not maybe provide the type of precision that you may be looking at. But if I'm looking at somebody who's about 70 to 74 years old today, who's a general retired, who's healthy, the age that they expected to live, the number of life years of the life expectancy is somewhere between 15 and maybe 17 years. So again, the best place to look it up would be page 42, but certainly the directions from the board, we can certainly provide more precisions to the number I gave to you by working with your staff, because we do have the tables at in the experience study report, but we can certainly expand that to, in order to answer the question. I hate to give you a range but not give you a more definitive answer, but we do have the tables in our experience study report which we can expand and better be able to answer that question.
Okay.
Okay, is there any more discussion, or do we have a motion to support the recommended contribution rates that Siegel is presenting?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second.
Okay, we're going to need a roll call vote. If Judy could please conduct the roll call vote. All those in favor?
For the record, I'd just like to clarify that we should be adopting the report and the contribution rates, recommended contribution rates included within.
Okay, yes.
Sherry, is that okay?
Yes.
Julie, is that okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Schottenmeier?
Yes.
Ms. Forrester?
Yes.
Ms. Cavanis?
Yes.
Mr. Parker? Ms. Smith?
Yes.
Mr. Cromer?
Aye.
Mr. Knudsen?
Yes.
Ms. Harris?
Aye.
And Mr. Jurdy?
Yes.
Thank you. Approved.
Okay.
If I may, through the chair, there was a request, at least from a couple of the trustees. I just want to make sure, is there direction for the actuary to come back with those additional figures if you shorten the years on the amortization? I wasn't sure if that was clear.
In order to facilitate that, we would need to give them direction as far as how many years we want it shortened by also. So that would need to be determined here.
So my understanding is that we would just request a study. So direction from staff to Siegel to do a study on shortening the years.
By how many years?
Chair Cavanis, wouldn't Andy and his team be able to make suggested different variations of the impact of the reduction of years versus reduction of 1 year versus 3 years versus 5 years? I mean, I think we want something reasonable. We're not talking about cutting it to 2 years, but I think Andy can make some scenarios for us as what that impact would be.
Yeah,
I mean, I would say no less than 15 years.
Agreed.
Yeah. Now, through the chair, this is Andy Young. I think the other possibility would be that I hear trustee wanting to coordinate, for example, the payment schedules with the counties paying off the POB. So what we can do is, once we have taken a look at that and provided with that information from the county, we can, for example, take an approach of, reduce that to 15 years. Or maybe another approach, which may be reasonable as well, would be for every 2 or 3% or whatever the increase in the contribution rate, how much is that going to buy down or cut or reduce the unfunded liability payment period? So in other words, I'll turn it into a cost approach. So given that the employer at the end of the day will have to make the payment, we can quantify that in terms of, for every 1% or 2% or 3%, whatever that makes sense, increase in the contribution rate, it is going to allow us to reduce that payment period by 1 year, 2 years. Of course, these are all made up numbers, but we can certainly do it that way too. And hopefully that would give the trustees some other alternative to take a look at. So in decreasing the payment period and come up with the contribution rate consequences, or we will come up with the reduction in the rate and see how much is that going to reduce the number of years. So I think both approaches can easily be done by Siegel.
Let me also comment, if nothing actually changes, then I mean, if there's not a large change in the years, then I'm not sure that we're going to get very interesting results. I mean, I'm not sure if that actually even makes sense now that I said that out loud. I'm sorry.
That's okay, Robert. I think it would be an interesting study to take a look at regardless.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Princey Cromer.
Did we not decide, I think it was this summer, to do the additional, more in-depth actuarial evaluation study that costs more money and is above and beyond what's required by the state? And we postponed that, I think, until next year.
That was a risk analysis, I believe, study, and the risk study wouldn't necessarily address this type of question.
I was just trying to see if it could be something that might be included in that to when we postpone that one, but it was just an idea.
Andy, could you clarify something for me, please? This is Doris speaking. While it was a 27 or 30 year, whatever amortization period for that restarted part that was essentially re-amortized, we've now essentially just kind of rounded the corner where the employer contribution and payment on that layer of the UAL will actually be in excess of the interest charge accruing on it, correct?
Yes, yes. So in other words, repeating what Doris just described, even though for the red layer, right? So we are still on this page of the report, 74 of the report. Even though it is a longer period of 19 years, but the payment that we are asking the employer and the employer is paying to the retirement association is enough to at least pay down the interest and leaving some amounts to pay off part of the UAL. So in no event would we expect the UAL that we would show on the previous page to actually go up over time now that the payment period is down to 19 years and it will become 18 and 17 the following years and so on and so forth. So even if we were to put the funding policy on autopilot, this UAL would be paid off. But I certainly appreciate the reason why the question came up is, can we make this UAL basically drop off any faster than the 19 years? So given the fact that the 19 years is the reason why you don't see on the previous page the UAL basically being paid off by the fund. So, and again, I reassure you that, and this is hopefully the page that will provide the reassurance to the board. So in spite of the fund only having a funding status of about 70%, the fact of the matter is the employer is continued to be asked to make payments to the UAL. So even if the board decides to do nothing, take no action, the funding policy would mandate that UAL be paid off. However, it would be over a period of 19 years during the funding policy. But we can certainly make that happen sooner rather than later. And I think it would be, now at least I would be very curious as to what happened if we were to superimpose, for example, the employer, the county's payment, the service payments, the debt service payment to the POB, the pension obligation bonds, and superimpose that on top of this graph. Because in this graph, remember, we have only taken the unfunded liability obligation of the retirement association and chart what the payments are. But I think it would be certainly be very insightful to me if we were to add the POB debt service and see the jump, the drop at the end of 8 years time, and see what happened if we were to just, for example, continue that debt service payment unchanged, and how can that money be utilized to basically pay down the UAL. So the fact of the matter is, even if the board decides it's interested in reducing the payment period to UAL, you don't really have to do it right away, right? You can do that in instructor actually. You like to do that in 5 years time or 8 years time when that POB debt service were to go away for the county. So we can certainly put another chart together on another side letter to basically provide to you if we were to coordinate the two streams of payments. How is that going to allow the board to basically at least try to buy down this red graph, rectangle, the payments to our restart layers? How is that going to basically make that go away sooner rather than later?
Okay. Are we all in agreement to give direction to Andy Young and Siegel to bring back a study on and time periods based on percentages of contribution? We don't get that.
Does this need to be a motion, Chair Cavanis?
I don't believe it does. We're just giving direction to Andy and Siegel. If you would like to do a motion, we certainly can.
I only want to add before for the discussion that I think the information would be good to the board. Like you said, we don't have to make any changes. It gives us information so we're more educated on how we can work towards that unfunded. I think we have limited opportunity to affect this unfunded because we're reliant on interest rates and other than that contributions. And so how can we drive down our unfunded liability would just be a way to look at, this could be a potential opportunity to look to the long term to get that unfunded paid down. So I just don't see where we have a lot of other flexibility. So I think the report would be valuable.
I have a comment.
Julie has alluded to the county's financial issues. I mean, we're in the shadow of a really big black swan right now, and we don't know how long this is going to go on and what the impacts are. And I'm just wondering, I guess, what is the viability of the county? And that said, I assume that we're a first claim creditor against the general fund, but in the bigger picture, what is the big impact of this on this plague that we have on the county's finances? Maybe Julie can help me on that. She's the closest to that, one of the closest to that.
Well, I guess I don't know what plague you mean on the county finances, other than the.
Well, I mean, this COVID thing that's going on, I mean, it's devastating at all levels.
So actually, I think that would be better for Chair Jury to answer. He's involved in the county budget, but I don't think that this is to adopt right now in any way to further put the county in a financial burden. It's merely just to look at this and see long-term, how can we get, and again, not adopting this immediately or not asking the county to pay more, but we need to look at this in a way to educate ourselves to get that unfunded reduced over a period of time. So maybe now's not the time to act on it, but I just think a report from Andy would be valuable so we have an idea how, if we can change that restart layer, because 30 years seems quite to be a long time. So, and that sounds like that was essentially like a mortgage refinance that we had to say, let's refinance for another 30 years. And so now I'm just saying, let's look at this and maybe it's 15. We have 19 left on it. So I don't think that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
This was similar to what we did when we adopted the layering. And I don't know, Andy might have a good idea of when that was, but we adopted layering and we had unfunded. I mean, we had negative amortization there and we got away from that. So we did do this, but it's probably at this point, maybe been 8 or 10 years ago since we've done any changes. But we did a huge change when we looked at the layering effect and went to 5-year amortizations and 18-year amortizations on certain things. When was that, Andy? Do you No?
Yeah, it was a good, almost 10 years ago. Yeah.
Okay, so it was a similar time that we were kind of looking at that point as to what we could do to help with that. And to Lee's question of what's going to happen with the county, with the plague, we have not seen that yet. We, as the county treasurer tax collectors, we are anticipating that we, throughout the state, are going to have a rash of bankruptcies. That there's just no way around that. Everybody's trying to brush up on their bankruptcy claims and all that kind of stuff because we don't know we have no idea what's going to happen. The county so far, we seem to kind of be hanging in there. We were hit heavy with TOT, when the lodging operators weren't operating, but we covered that with cannabis tax. So we are a little insulated, it seems like, at this moment, but I don't think we know yet. And I think we're gonna see that as we go forward here the next year or two. I think there's a lot that we don't know. I think that that we don't know right at this point. We don't know what we don't know. And I think it's definitely, you can't take the hit that this state has taken the last, the country, I mean, the world, everybody's taken, and be unaffected. I think it's going to roll out in phases. I think so far, I mean, our budget was fine this year. We did okay, but I don't think that's going forward the next, 1, 2, 3 years, I think is when we're going to be, when we'll be able to see really the fallout from this.
Yeah.
Yes, and I'd like to add that we need to check with Andy to see if there would be a fee associated with this. Because where the information might be interesting to have a discussion about, if they're going to charge us a fee for something we know we're not going to be able to implement, I don't see doing that.
Yeah, I think like we did 8 years ago, 10 years ago, when we were doing the review of the funding policy, including the amortization period, I think that kind of service is really not anticipated as part of our ongoing work with MSERA. So on the one hand, we will charge you, but I think in this case, the charge may not be that big, but it is important to acknowledge the fact that if you're wanting to have the information for planning purposes, we don't have to, for example, in our work, in our special study, anticipate that, the board is going to make a change in the next valuation. We can certainly, with direction from the board, take into account that, no, you don't want to do this until the county pay off its pension obligation bond, which is 8 years from now. So we can certainly take all of that, take that into account. Or on the other hand, if you think, no, waiting another 8 years is too long, so why don't you, Siegel, just let us know if we were to reduce the payment period by 1 year, for example, just 1 year. How much is that going to increase the employer's contribution rate? So we can certainly come back with some scenarios that may be of interest to the board, which you think might be more viable than others. But all of that, the bottom line is a work that we have not anticipated as part of our contract, and we would require special fee. So if the body would be more comfortable in knowing what that fee would be, I think we may have to either work with the board directly or your staff as to what kind of scenarios would be of most value and most practical to the board.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
What I could do is rough outline a couple of scenarios and get a price cost from Andy on providing a study to reflect that and bring that back for the board's consideration before any work is undertaken. And that way you can confirm if the scenarios outlined will indeed provide the board with the information they may be interested in seeing.
And
did anybody else want to have, is there any more discussion on this before we decide what to ask Andy to do?
Yeah, I have a comment on, so the chart that is on the screen right now that ends in 2038. If there is a lack of performance to our expectations for this year, and that chart comes back, will that chart include a new 2039, meaning we add one more column of debt to pay and it goes out for those 18 years?
I think the short answer is yes, although on the other hand, when we're looking at the payment, I'm really hoping that that payment will not, that unfavorable, for example, experience is not going to be as great as what we are looking at, right, for this restart layer. So yeah, so unfortunately, with the way that the calculation works is every year there's a need for an actuarial study because there would be some surprises. But the good news is that you can see there are sometimes negative surprises, right, because that increased the contribution rate. But there are also positive surprises when the contribution rate goes down. So I think when we were going through the amortization schedule, I kind of point out the fact that even though we have over $240 million in unfunded liability, but most of the unfunded liability can be traced back to two roots. One would be because of the 3 or 4 experience assumption studies that when we recommend more conservative, more realistic actuarial assumptions that increase the unfunded liability by about half of the 244. The rest really was because of the restart layer. So if the experience from the last 10 plus years were to be good indication going forward, we would expect to see some layers of unfunded that would be added that increase the cost of the plan, but they would hopefully be offset by enough positive or reduction in the UAL. Hopefully that's what has transpired in the last 10 years will again will hold true in the following years. Yeah. So unfortunately, this measurement will continue, some positive, some negative, but at least based on the experience of the fund, I think really we are talking about the assumption changes, which are the blue as well as and they're now being weighted down by the restart layer. So that's why it appears to the employer, and I can certainly agree with the employers, that how come the contribution rate has done nothing but up is because we just need to get this UAL from the restart layer under control. And I can certainly agree with some of the comments made by the board.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Sherry. I wasn't sure if I was on mute or not, just to make sure that, to clarify, did Andy, the POBs, they'll be paid off in 2026. So it's about 5.5 years or so.
Okay.
is when they'll be paid off.
Yeah.
So, and I'll just add one more thing if I can. We should be looking at the long-term planned health, not 1 year based on COVID impact to the current financial situation with the county or the state, this is part of the normal course of a long-term plan. And so although I don't think we need to necessarily act, I think the information is good, but I don't think we need to take the last year that we have behind us and assume that that's how our economic future is going to play out. That remains to be seen at this point, and we are looking for the long term. So that's the reason why I'm interested in seeing it and how we can get that paid down.
So are we in agreement to give direction to staff to work up several scenarios and regarding cost and present those to Andy and Siegel, and then proceed from there and bring that information back possibly at our next meeting? Is everyone in agreement with that? Are there any objections? Okay, then I believe that's where we're headed with this presentation. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
Catherine?
Yes.
It's Jerry.
Yes.
I think we should have the two graphs, the one on 73 and 74, made into charts, and they fit with all the decorating that we've been doing here in the office when we get back in again, and just point people to the charts and say, look at this. This is when we'll be out of it. So that's very much tongue in cheek, but I think they're very pretty on top of being informative.
Yeah, it's helpful. It will keep keep that on our minds consistently. Okay. All right. Andy, are you okay with progressing to the next agenda item with your session on GAT
Yeah.
67?
Yeah. So I do have the other report for Governmental Accounting Standard 67 on my computer. I think for this item, I will just turn it over to Dirk. I know Dirk only has a couple of remarks that he wants to make, because this is, again, the report that we will be providing for the purpose of satisfying the Governmental Accounting Standards Board requirement for producing the comprehensive financial annual report for the fund. So Dirk, which page of the report would you like us to walk through with the board today?
Can you turn to page 12, please? So this is a snapshot of liabilities and assets, just to remind the board of a couple of terms. Talk about total pension liability. That's very similar to the actuarial accrued liability under the funding valuation. There's some slight differences, which I'll mention in a minute. Second line is plans, fiduciary, net position, which refer to assets. For GASB purposes, these are market value of assets as opposed to smooth value of assets under the funding basis. And then the third item is net pension liability. That's similar to an unfunded liability, but again, on a market value basis. These numbers would be pretty similar to what you would have seen up front in the funding report. However, you might note the footnote down at the bottom. There are several members at MCERA that work in multiple memberships, for instance, general and safety. And in the funding valuation, the liabilities are determined assuming that the current plan of benefits has always been in place. In terms of GASB, we reflect the movement between the membership groups, general safety to probation to whatever the case may be. So there's a slight difference in the liabilities that you'll see in this report versus what you'll see in the funding report. So the snapshot here on a market value basis is that we're 67.7% funded at June 30, 2020. Let me have you turn to page 16. So this shows a progression of how we got to that point on page 12. The top section is the progression of the total pension liabilities. This kind of middle portion is the progression of the market value of assets. And then the bottom would be an expression of the unfunded or the net pension liability. And that amount is also expressed as a percentage of your covered payroll down at the bottom of $72 million. So your net pension liability is $256 million on a market value basis, expressed as a percentage of covered payroll. That has increased from last year's 314.6% up to 356.5%. Just a couple more pages to take you through. We'll go over to page 20. So this shows a progression of the fund. We show one extra year up top of what actually happened from July 1, 2019 through June 30, 2020. So the top row is what actually happened to the fund on a market value basis. And then going forward, it's a projection of what happens to the contributions, benefit payments, assumed earnings, etc. So this is an illustration that under the 6.75% investment return scenario, the fund would have enough assets to pay the promised benefits. If you go down to the very bottom of that page, you'll see that there's basically $5 million left over when all of the benefit payments have expired. And that's basically the value of your contingency reserve at this point in time. One final page I'll have you turn to is page 15. So this is a sensitivity test required by GASB. So the middle figure is your net pension liability under the current 6.75% investment return assumption. That's the 256 million, quote, unfunded that we've been discussing. There's a sensitivity requirement of if you change the discount rate and just the discount rate up or down by 1% to a 1% decrease, resulting in a 5.75% discount rate. 1% increase, obviously, is 7.75. So that would change the net pension liability from 361 million if you decrease the discount rate, or 170 million unfunded if you increase the discount rate to 7.75%. So that's basically what we have for our prepared remarks. I don't know if there are any questions. Okay, I'll assume none. Turn it back to Andy.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Dirk. Again, this is a report we have been providing to the association to report this so-called net pension liability. I think once the board approves the report, we will be producing something very comparable, except that we would take the $256 million in liability and basically allocate that amount to 3 employer categories that we have, the employers that we have, the county, the Superior Court, and the cemetery. So I think that's something that we will do, and that report will come later, actually in the early part of next year, and that would be required to allow the employers to finish their financial statements. So I think with that, I will turn it back to the board and to the Madam Chair.
Do we have a motion to accept the report, the GAS 7 report?
Catherine, could I ask Andy a question before something just occurred to me? Andy, when we were going through the actuarial report, one of the calculations showed interest for the year of like $14 million, 14.8 million. You had the normal cost and then the interest, and it showed how the unfunded increased.
Mm-hmm.
And on the GASB, the interest is showing is 51 million, almost $52 million. They obviously aren't the same interest to be that different.
That's right, because on page 16 of the report, when we calculate the interest in this case, the interest is imputed on the total amount of the liability. So the total amount of the liability is over $700 million. That's different from the interest that we apply in the funding report to the difference between the liability and the assets, which is the UAL. So in other words, as you rightly point out, when I mentioned to the board, anytime we have an unfunded liability, and when the employer is not making the payment to pay that off right away, right, which cannot not happen. But when that happens, we charge them interest at the rate of now going forward 6.75%. On the other hand, when we have money sitting in the account of 500 million, we expect that money to earn interest at the assumed rate of 6.75. So it's really the interest that we expect to earn on the assets, plus the interest that we do expect to earn on the assets that we do not have, which is the UAL. So those two combined together is what gave rise to the 51 billion. So it is bigger for that reason. So it's interest on the full liability, including assets that we have, as well as the unfunded liability on assets that we don't.
Okay.
Okay, do we have a motion?
I move that we accept the actuarial report.
I'll second that.
Is there any discussion on the motion? Okay, we're going to take a roll call vote. Judy, would you please do the roll call vote? All those in favor?
Ms. Shotmeyer,
Yes.
Ms. Forrester,
Yes.
Ms. Cavanis,
Yes.
Mr. Parker,
Yes.
Ms. Smith,
Yes.
Mr. Cromer,
Aye.
Mr. Knudsen,
Yes.
Ms. Harris,
Aye.
and Mr. Jurdy.
Yes.
Approved.
Okay. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
And we'll see you soon at,
Okay.
all right.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Signing off. Thank you. Have a good,
Thanks, Andy.
good day, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Okay, so now we're going on to discussion and possible action regarding investment matters. So turn it over to Robert.
Yeah, I think Callan's on the way, right? Or
Callan is in the waiting room. I don't know if anybody needs a break before we move on to them.
How about
Yes.
take a break? 10 minutes, 10:35. That agreeable to everyone to be back 10:35? Okay.
Dan Jurdy. Dan,
Yeah. Hi, Jerry.
do you know who won the two supervisor races?
The website was updated late last night.
Are you there?
I'm here.
Okay. Okay.
Nobody named Richard Lee around here.
Okay. Okay, Mr. And so we're on to agenda item 5 regarding investment matters, and Callan is going to be presenting. Hello.
Ooh, they must be having some trouble.
Looks like they're trying to connect to audio and yeah, having some technical issues.
Okay. Well, there's Greg.
Hi.
Claire.
Hi, everyone. How are you?
Okay. Well,
Hi.
great. Here.
Hey, Gary, are you, I don't know if he can, are you calling from the 408-623-5658?
Yes.
Thank
Can
you.
you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great.
We're ready to hear from you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, we'll get started. Really, there's not a lot for us to talk about today, so it could be a quick recap. I'm joking. Hopefully, you all had some rest over the night and didn't stay up too late watching all of the returns come in. And Jim Anderson, it's a pleasure to see you. It's been a long time. Hope you're doing well.
If I may, Madam Chair, nice to see you too, Greg. Yeah, looking forward to coming back.
We have a few topics to talk to you about today. First, we have a update on performance. And then Gary Chang is going to spend some time walking through the international equity portfolio and come up with ways we could restructure it or not restructure it. But before we get into all of that, we thought we'd do a quick capital market update, and then Claire's going to walk through performance before handing it over to Gary. So that's what we have on the agenda today.
Great.
How best is it to share the presentation? Do you want us to drive, or does someone else want to manage the collateral, the presentation?
Well, I think you do a great job, and unless anybody else is interested in doing it, it'd be great for you to do it.
Okay, great. Claire, do you want to share your screen?
Sure thing.
Wonderful. So I guess the most topical thing to do would be to talk about the election and what are the implications of that. First, before we get into that, I think we should sit back and think about the previous elections we've had and note that the initial reaction isn't always the long-term reaction. And in my experience working with asset owners over the last 20 years is in both when Obama was elected and Trump was first elected, there was overreaction about what it meant. And one of the takeaways I have from that is that we have politicians who solve the problems we are faced with, but they do not categorically change the face that we have certain problems. Or maybe problem isn't the right word. Maybe the right word is basic conditions in which we are operating. So the basic conditions in which we're operating haven't changed. We're still in a pandemic. We still have technology driving the economy, and technology is inflationary or deflationary and very disruptive. We still have an aging population, and inflation remains really low. So as a long-term investor, those base circumstances haven't changed. And this is not to mean that elections don't matter, because they do. But we often over-extrapolate the importance of them on the long-term investment outlook. But it does matter. But it does matter. I don't want anyone to walk away with that impression. So why does it matter today? So first initial reactions is that we're going to have a divided government, and no one party is going to control all of the House, the Senate, the presidency. So that's a big takeaway there. And what that means is that the policies that get passed and enacted are most likely to be more moderate than leaning one way or the other, right? So what does that mean? You need consensus or you have gridlock. So anything that gets passed is going to have to be more of a consensus item than something that either party has on their far wish list, right? So whether it's the Green New Deal or tax cuts, neither of those things are probably going to happen if we have a divided government. So what that means is that there will be a stimulus, but it's going to be more modest. And so for that reason, you'll see that in the market today, that the stock market's up pretty meaningfully, but inflation expectations are coming down and yields came down a little bit. So that means there won't be over stimulus or over issuance of debt. I say that in quotes, relative to what it could have been if it was a blue wave. So I think that's in part why the market is reacting the way it is today. It probably means that tax policy isn't going to change dramatically, because any tax policy has to pass the Senate. And it looks like the Senate is going to be Republican controlled going forward. Not all the votes are counted, but that's certainly what it looks like. And whoever is governing, it doesn't look like they're going to have a mandate, right? It's hard to come out and say, I have a mandate by the people to go get this stuff done, get out of my way. So it's either going to be gridlock or moderate policy going through. If there is a change in the president, perhaps it's going to be a less confrontational policy with our trading partners. So some international markets might be doing well for that reason. And then finally, if the map works out the way it looks right now, it looks like it might be harder for litigation to drive an outcome. So what that means is that it may not be as prolonged and painful as it was in Bush v. Gore in 2000, right? So there could be a quicker resolution relative to what we saw with Bush v. Gore. And the market likes that. And in part, I think that's why you see a pretty good rally today. Also within the rally, you saw within California that Uber and Lyft those stocks are running today. And naturally that's pushing up the NASDAQ and the stock market. So a few quick thoughts on the election. We're not done with it. It's not over. A lot of things to figure out still, but those are a few quick thoughts right now. So with that, I'll flip ahead and provide a little background about what happened in the markets for September. And here we're talking to you about performance through September to help you manage the portfolios and do your fiduciary duty. Big takeaway in September is that stock markets continue to rally. You see the US stock market, large cap stocks were up about 9% in the quarter. And year to date, they're up about 5.5%. Where's the pandemic in these numbers? They're not showing up. And that's because there's massive amounts of stimulus and deficit spending, as well as from the Federal Reserve pumping liquidity into the system. Now, one thing we should note is that the US stock market's up a lot, but there's a big divergence between some companies doing extremely well and some companies not doing as well. If you look at the year-to-date returns, large cap stocks are up about 6%, but small cap stocks are actually down about almost 9 percentage points. So the average company out there isn't doing as well as the really big companies, and most notably the really large tech companies, the growth-oriented companies. And you can see that in particular in the small cap market, where for a year-to-date time period, small cap growth is up 4%. Small cap value, so small companies who have a low price to earnings ratio, are actually down about 20%. So a huge divergence in the market. And that's important for us to remember, because when we evaluate the performance of the managers, we want to look at, okay, what pond are they fishing in? And is the problem with the pond or the problem with the way they're fishing? And right now, there's a problem with the pond more than most managers are fishing poorly. Okay. So let's flip ahead to page 4. Let's talk about the rebound in the stock market. What this chart shows is the yellow is from peak to trough and then back again for the current bear market that we have just exited. So what's interesting about this bear market, it was induced by an event, the pandemic, and it led to a very quick sell-off and then a huge rebound. So this is clearly saying V-shaped recovery for us right here. It's a V-shaped recovery in the stock market. And you compare that to previous bear markets, the drawdown was faster and the snapback was much stronger. So this is arguing that, okay, we're going to get back to normal real quick. But what might be a more accurate way to look at this is actually we're looking at a K-shaped economy where certain companies are roaring back, certain employees are doing just fine, but then there's big categories of the stock market not doing well. And certainly there are a lot of the population who is not doing well because, well, they're not back to full employment yet. So the K-shaped economy we think might be a better description here. And the stock market is not the economy. Okay, let's flip ahead to page 7. Thank you, Claire. So the stock market isn't the economy. Well, how's the economy doing? Well, in the second quarter, we had a drop of 33% in GDP. In the first quarter, we were down about 5%. So we dug a pretty big hole. Now, it's great. In the third quarter, we're up about 30% in GDP. But what is more important now is the level of GDP, not the change, right? So our level of GDP, our aggregate output, goods, services, employment, is still lower than it was at the beginning of the year. So our economy is still smaller than it was at the beginning of the year, even if we had this big snapback in the quarter. Inflation remains really low and contained. Its last print is 1.4%, excluding food and energy. If you wrap in energy, it's actually down 1.5%. And this is something that the Fed is targeting. They really want inflation to run north of 2 for a prolonged time period, because that helps our economy in the long run. But they're having a hard time doing that. They're having a hard time generating that. And every cue from the Fed is that they can't fix it from here on out. And it has to be fiscal stimulus, meaning spending more money by the government than they take in. The Federal Reserve is telling the government that right now. You need to spend more money than you take in to stimulate the economy going forward, because the Fed can't do it anymore. Okay, flipping to page 9. I made that comment earlier that the market is not the economy. And to drive that point a little bit, here's what I think is just a fascinating chart. On the far right, this is the S&P 500. If you divide it up in terms of industries, okay, if you look at the US large cap stock market, about 40% of it is technology related companies. Huge component. Next component, 14% healthcare, financial services, 12%. So you invest in the US stock market, these are the type of companies you're investing in. Now let's ask a question. Okay, those companies are doing great. How many people do they employ? How much of the economy do they represent? On employment's in the middle, and on the far left is GDP. So how much of the economy do they represent? Technology represents less than 6% of, about 6% of GDP and just a couple percent of employment. So these companies are doing great. They're making a lot of money, but they don't employ a lot of people. And that's why this K-shaped recovery is taking place. Now, also important to note in here, government employment is the light blue up at the top, right? There's no stock for the government, but the government certainly does employ a lot of people and employs about a third of the population. Okay, so the market is not the economy. Okay, 14 and unemployment. So are people getting back to work? And the answer is yes. So they're coming back off of their unemployment. And so what we're showing here are a couple things: the initial unemployment rolls and then continuing unemployment. Unemployment is coming down, but it still stays elevated by most measures. And the initial jobless claims is a really interesting thing to watch. That's a 4-week moving average that we look at. And the last few prints, so it's 4-week rolling, so it looks back. It's not like exactly last week. And so it's kind of smooth. We're coming in about, 800,000 is when we printed this. It's now about 700,000. So it's coming down, which is great. But keep in mind, in the depth of the global financial crisis, that was negative 600,000 jobs. So we're still losing more jobs than we did the financial crisis on this one measure. So something to keep in mind about how the economy will come roaring back. And then on 16. There we go. And 16 here, I just wanted to point out one other thing. When we look at manager performance in the stock market in particular, big dispersion between the types of companies that are doing well. You'll see energy was actually down in the quarter about 20%. Oil remains depressed, right? It remains really low. So energy companies continue to struggle. Real estate's about flat. We all know what's going on there. And then the leaders remain in more of the growth-oriented sectors. So we're going to see a big dispersion in your manager performance. And again, we got to keep in mind, is it the pond they're fishing in, or are they not fishing the right way? Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Claire, who's going to walk through the performance for the plan, unless there are any questions or comments.
Okay, great. So I'll start on page 21 here, just looking at total plan growth over time for the investment program. So the last 15 years of ending market value is captured in the top chart here. And the point that jumps out to me most is one, that the directionality has certainly been up and to the right. And if we look at just the far right side here, you can see the dramatic decline and recovery of the total market value just in the last 3 quarters. Now, most notably, the line has ended at a new high point. So the recovery experienced in the previous quarter, the second quarter of the year, and then subsequent positive returns in the most recent quarter, the third quarter, have brought that total ending market value up to a new high. And that's $566.8 million. So that's where the plan was as of the end of September 30th. And that represents an increase of about $28 million over the course of the quarter. So the program experienced $30.8 million in aggregate investment gains and paid out about $2.5 million in benefit payments. Very consistent benefit payments quarter over quarter. You'll see in this net new investment column here, benefit payments were paid out of domestic equity. Robert does a great job of pulling assets from any allocation that is slightly overweight to maintain that key balance in the portfolio to target weights. And that's really shown here from the bigger picture on slide 22. So this chart shows actual asset allocation of the portfolio on the left versus the strategic target on the right. And these two remain well in line, a reflection of that diligent rebalancing over time. Now you'll note that both the target allocation and the actual allocation will shift here in the next likely quarter or so as the new allocation to infrastructure is funded. So that'll be about 6% of the portfolio once funded. The majority of that coming from international equity. So international equity will go down by about 4% and 1% each coming from domestic equity and fixed income to fund that 6% to infrastructure. Slide 23 looks at your program's asset allocation versus peers, so versus other public fund sponsors. And no real changes here yet. Again, in green is circled where that infrastructure allocation will show up once it's funded. But the key takeaway from those asset categories circled in orange, which are the ones that are employed in the program, is that this program uses more domestic equity and international equity than some public fund peers. Nothing new. The board, of course, did look at that again closely in the recent asset liability study and did confirm that it remains a good direction for the plan for the long term for now. On slide 24, we look at that asset allocation in more detail. A couple things to point out here. First, importantly, that the managers remain balanced by style. So if you go through each asset category and look at the managers employed, growth and value remain well in balance. Everything is being implemented as intended. And secondly, you'll note that this large cap equity portfolio will look different next quarter. As you all know, the board took a deep dive look at the structure of the domestic equity portfolio last quarter and did decide to eliminate the active managers within large cap equity. So that's Boston Partners and Harbor Cap, as well as the equal weighted S&P 500 index. So those three mandates, representing about $100 million of the portfolio, will be moved to the passive Vanguard S&P 500 index over the coming quarter. The board's directive was to do that gradually rather than in one big chunk. So there is a good plan that Robert is moving forward with executing to do that over the course of the next 4 months. So when we look at this page next quarter, you'll see movement out of those three funds, which will have happened in equal increments over the next 4 months, expected to be completed in January. Performance. Another good quarter, very much driven by that allocation to public equity. So the total fund returned 5.68% in the quarter, outperforming its strategic target benchmark of 5.52%. So another good quarter on the back of a very strong second quarter this year. Similar to what Greg commented on the capital markets, there's really no sign of that pandemic in these results. So notably positive across the board, a very strong absolute return for the trailing year, up 8.8%, and longer term returns remain solid as well. You'll note that the gray distribution here represents the peer group, so the performance of other public funds. And the blue dot is the total fund performance, the green triangle representing the performance of the target, so the index implementation of that strategic target. A very good quarter in the 12th percentile, so very tip top of that group over the recent quarter. Similar story across the board over both near-term and longer-term time periods. Over the trailing 15 years, the total fund is up 6.97%, almost 7% annualized, ahead of the strategic target, up 6.7%. '26 looks at calendar year returns. Most notable to me is just that year-to-date number on the far left here. With the plan up 1.78% year-to-date, of course, this is not the fiscal year, this is the calendar year-to-date. But what changed here in the recent quarter is that number has flipped to positive. So again, hiding the sharp drawdown that we saw in the first quarter of the year. I'll skip over the fiscal year returns as there's no big change there. The current fiscal year to date, of course, being just the recent quarter. Slide 29 here looks at cumulative returns. So we look at annualized returns, but what about over the last 15 years? If I invested $1, what does that mean for the portfolio today versus if we just used index funds over the course of that time period to implement the strategic target? And the blue line represents the portfolio, which is remains ahead of the green line, which would be the target, the passive implementation of that target. So if you invested $100 million 15 years ago, you would be better off today, or you are better off today than you would have been with just index funds implementing that target. And then on slide 31, we look at attribution. So I noted that the portfolio did outperform its strategic target in the last quarter. But what drove that? So in blue, you can see the actual return of 5.68% here, outperforming the 5.52% return of the target. And that was driven by your active managers. As Greg mentioned, we'll spend some time today talking about the international equity portfolio in particular. That is the portion of the portfolio that did drive outperformance in the recent quarter, so contributing about 41 basis points to total fund performance in the quarter. What detracted was the implementation of the domestic equity portfolio. Again, there will be changes coming through per the decisions made by the board last quarter. What about over the longer time period? So it's been a great quarter for international equity. The international equity managers have done very well over the trailing year as well. But that's been the asset category most challenged for this program. So over the trailing 5 years, you can see a manager effect of negative 27 basis points for international equity. Again, over 5 years. And importantly, that does include asset managers that are no longer in the program. Still, over the trailing 5 years, the portfolio has added 8.35%, so a very strong absolute return behind the target of 9.07%. And then on 32 and 33, we look at all of the individual manager performance for the managers in the program, so all of the detailed implementation of the portfolio. The domestic equity portfolio was up 8.38%, behind the return of the Russell 3000 index. Again, within large cap, we're going to see some changes coming through here next quarter. So I won't spend too much time there. Consistent with Greg's comments of growth and value, all of the managers in the domestic equity portfolio, you can see that come through. So the value managers turning in notably different performance than the growth managers, but that by and large being a reflection of the pond that they're fishing in, to use Greg's analogy. So within mid-cap, Fidelity Low Price Stock and Janus implementing the mid-cap portfolio. Fidelity low price stock has done quite well over the trailing year, turning in a positive 4% gain versus a negative return for its value benchmark. Janus has had a really tough year, actually. If you look at the trailing 3 quarters in particular, they've trailed that mid-cap growth benchmark, which is notably driven by just a narrow few names. So that's been a hindrance to their relative performance. But if you look over longer time periods, the previous 9 years, they've done quite well versus that benchmark. They do continue to stick to that valuation discipline, making sure that they, well, per their strategy, being careful not to chase momentum, which has really been a driver of that benchmark. And then within small cap, Prudential's performance in the first quarter was quite notable, significantly underperforming their value benchmark. The Prudential portfolio, small cap value portfolio, is a deep value strategy. That is what it's designed to do. They have outperformed in the recent 2 quarters, which we're pleased to see, but significant underperformance in the trailing year still. Now, importantly, within your portfolio, that's balanced by a true deeper growth manager within the small cap space. So AB, US small cap growth, turning in a very different performance over the trailing year, up almost 37%. Again, a very good balance to the Prudential deep value small cap value portfolio. And then within international equity, again, a very good quarter, a very good year. Longer term returns have been more challenged on a relative basis. In the recent quarter, the international equity portfolio was up 7.8% versus 6.4% for the target. That's the MSCI ACWI ex-US index. Over the trailing year, up 5.2% versus 3.45% for that benchmark. Longer term, over the trailing 10 years, 15 years, up 4% versus 4.4 and up 5% versus 3.6. Similar to what we've seen within the domestic equity portfolios, the value managers, so the value-oriented managers, Oakmark and Mondrian, turning in negative returns, which is consistent with what we would expect for their strategies and also that value orientation. Euro-Pacific Growth and Harbor, both with more of a growth orientation to their portfolio, turning in pretty strong positive returns. Gary will talk more about the structure of this portfolio in a minute, but notably the T. Rowe Price International Small Cap allocation was added the last time we did an international equity review. That is an allocation to small cap that's not included in the benchmark and has certainly been successful for the program. So that manager up almost 14% in the recent quarter, a pretty remarkable 30% return over the trailing year, and over the trailing 3 years up 8%. So that has certainly been an additive allocation within that international equity portfolio. Pretty steady and consistent returns out of fixed income. So Dodge and Cox remain good complements to each other, turning in performance almost identical to each other in the quarter despite very different approaches. So Dodge and Cox being more bottom up, overweight investment grade credit, PIMCO taking more of a top down view, seeing outperformance from their interest rate strategies, from their duration and curve positioning. Longer term, both managers have done very well and again have continued to complement each other well. And then lastly, a slight negative return out of real estate due to valuation. So income has now become the greater percentage of return for both of those managers, consistent with what we would expect from the change in the market. So previously appreciation was dominating return for real estate in general and for both of these managers. That has shifted back to income becoming the bigger portion of return. And then again, total fund returns at the bottom here, same numbers that we've looked at previously, notably all positive and very strong from an absolute perspective. Are there any questions on performance? I do want to be mindful that we get enough time on the international equity structure discussion.
A quick question, not on directly on that, but we had our actuaries in this morning, and at their recommendation some time ago, we went from 7% assumption down to 6 3/4. And as I look at this, and I look at the last 5, 7, 10, and 15 years, we're right at 7% again. Can you look in the future and see where we might be? Is 7% a reasonable earnings assumption to go back to? It means $25 million in our unfunded liability if we make a change.
You know, Tim, I'd have to run those numbers to give you a precise answer to that question. But a few points. When we run our numbers, we're looking at a 7 to 10 year time horizon, whereas your actuary's looking at a 30-year time horizon. So we often have a lower return than the actuary will have. Because what the actuary is saying is we're going to go back to something normal. I don't mean to speak for the actuary, but often actuaries will say that we'll revert back to something a little more normal, and where we will look at the market right now and say, well, bond yields are so low that it's going to limit our ability to achieve the same return over the next 5 years, let's say. We do our capital market expectations on an annual basis, and we're working on them right now. That's one of the things that Gary does along with his group. And we are faced with the issue that bond yields have fallen so much that our return expectations will drop. Our forward-looking return expectations will drop. And it's just a question of how much. And we need to go through kind of a long diligence process to come up with, okay, what exactly is that number? But we hoping to have those numbers in the next month or so. So maybe when we get back, the next time we meet with you, I'll be able to give you a slightly more direct answer in that regard, Tim. But they're going to come down. Our return expectations, forward-looking return expectations will come down. Just a question of how much.
Unfortunately, I won't be here to get that information, but I can come back, I guess.
We love visitors, Tim.
It'll be public.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Unless there's any other questions, I will move ahead to the international equity structure evaluation discussion and pass this back to Greg and Gary to intro and walk through.
Yeah, so I'll just tee up this conversation and then let Gary walk through the great work he completed. And just to kind of set course of what we have been doing and why we're doing this, we did an asset liability study a year ago now, came up with a new target asset allocation. The amount of dollars we have in international equity will be coming down over the long run as we fund infrastructure. And after we did the AL study, we said, okay, we're going to look at each asset class and say, should we re-optimize what we're doing here? We did the domestic equity one, and we said, okay, I don't want to take active risk anymore in US large cap equity because data shows that it's kind of a coin flip there, and I'd rather spend my active risk somewhere else. So when we did that study, we said, okay, let's make a change, get rid of those active large cap managers and take active risk somewhere else. So now today we're taking a look at international equity, and we're asking a few questions. Do we like what we have, or could we be doing something better? And kind of a few things that we take a look at are, okay, should we be investing more in passive? Should we change the mix we have in international small cap or emerging market equity? Should we be doing anything differently? So Gary's going to walk you through it, but before getting through it all, I just wanted to share with you the punchline. We went through this, we took a close look, and we said, you know what? Our point of view is what you're doing today is good, and we wouldn't make a change. And in part, that's because we did the same exercise about 4 years ago, And at that time, we said, okay, here are a couple of gaps. Here's some things we want to change. And so we looked at that time, we added your dedicated emerging market equity manager and your dedicated international small cap manager. So we added those about 4 years ago. We kind of revamped it then. And we think the decisions that were made at that time are still good moving forward. So that's the punchline. Now, Gary's going to walk through the analysis to share with you our thought process and then justify why we had that point of view. And then, of course, at the end of the day, it's your call. But that's where we're going to start off with. So that's a little bit of the backdrop. Any questions before I hand it over to Gary? Okay, great. Gary, please walk us through the study if you don't mind.
Okay, great. Good morning, everybody. Appreciate everybody's time today. And as Greg mentioned, we've taken a close look at your international equity structure to see if we think where you are positioned right now is appropriate, and also to show you a couple alternatives that you might consider. But at the end of the day, looking through all of the analysis that we've done, we feel that where you are right now is still appropriate. So I'll start out by spending a couple minutes going over your manager structure process and approach, which will be very similar in concept to what you heard from Jay Klepper in the domestic equity review just a couple months ago. And then next, we'll evaluate your current structure and provide some observations. And finally, we'll explore some alternative structures for consideration, see what the pros and the cons are of switching to these alternatives. So Claire, if you don't mind skipping a page to 41, please. So our high-level philosophy behind international equity structure is to start with a broad opportunity set, and that's represented by your asset class benchmark, the MSCI All Country World ex-US. And we believe that's a good representation of the international equity market as a whole. So when we think about the starting point for a manager structure, your managers in total should reflect the characteristics of this benchmark. And from the starting point, we could take a look to see whether there are particular styles or regions that we have stronger conviction in, and whether or not to overweight those areas. Right, some examples that you already have are the small cap and emerging markets. So it's important to consider also the risk and reward trade-off, though. If you have a structure that overweights certain areas of the markets, that's going to come at the cost of additional tracking error. In other words, the potential to overperform or underperform more. Just as importantly, we need to consider where active management makes sense and where it should be used, as that has a big impact on what the structure looks like as well. So when we go over the analysis shortly, we'll refer to some of these points that I just mentioned, such as how much emerging markets or small cap there is relative to your starting point or your asset class benchmark. So if you don't mind, Claire, moving to 43. Great. So here we've laid out some of the historical results of active management in international equity. And as you might recall, when Jay Klepper showed you the data for US equity just a month ago, certain areas such as large cap US equity didn't appear very compelling in terms of active management. But in contrast here, you could see that at least historically on average, active management has outperformed the benchmark 1% to 2% gross of fees. And even once you include fees, there's still a compelling case that active management can add value across all of the markets here shown on this page. So let's take a look at the current structure next on page 46. There's a lot of information on this page, but we've summarized the current structure at the top of this page. You have 6 international managers, as Claire mentioned, 1 dedicated emerging markets, and 1 dedicated international small cap manager in InvestTech and T. Rowe. And so this structure was put in place roughly 3 years ago, as these 2 managers were hired in 2017. And 4 other managers round out this structure: Harbor, Oakmark, Euro Pacific, and Mondrian. Just as a reminder, the asset class benchmark here is the MSCI ACWI ex-US. And this benchmark is a standard benchmark, so it only has large cap stocks and mid cap stocks and no small cap. So one observation about your current structure right from the start is that because of T. Rowe, you're getting about 15 to 16% in small cap exposure, whereas the benchmark has none. So the structure does have a tilt towards small cap. At the bottom left of the page, we show some of the regional and style exposures of the current structure. In terms of regional weights, and what I mean by that is the split between developed markets and emerging markets. When we look at emerging markets, the emerging markets weight of your current structure has been relatively consistent with the benchmark. And when we look at the bottom left-hand chart, here we're showing Z-scores. A positive Z-score represents a tilt towards growth. A negative score represents value. And so you can see your current structure has a slight growth tilt over time. And when you look at risk, so I'm looking at the bottom right-hand corner, your current structure when compared to peers does appear to have slightly higher risk. And so that risk number is shown on the horizontal axis. And higher risk actually relative to the benchmark as well, the ACWX US. And a lot of that is being driven by one manager in particular, Oakmark. So let's skip a page, Claire, to 48. So on this page, we're looking at tracking error. And I just want to spend a moment talking about tracking error. The way to think about this is the more of it you have, the more tracking error you have, the larger the outperformance or underperformance can be on average. But the key point is that not all tracking error is bad. If you have higher conviction in your managers to be able to beat their benchmark, that might be a desirable thing to have. And so when you look at the chart on the left, what this is showing is the tracking error of your structure compared to other peers, other public funds. And so you can see that it's slightly above average to average. So your tracking error is about 2.5% to 3% annualized. And so when we talk about the alternatives that we'll show you next, we'll look at some options to lower that tracking error, as well as the overall risk or the standard deviation of your structure. So on the next page, just to quickly summarize, quick summary of your structure is that we do see a small cap tilt because of T row. We do see a slight growth tilt also due to T row, but regional exposures are much in line with the benchmark. We see slightly higher volatility, slightly higher tracking error compared to peers. So I'll pause here if there are any comments or questions on your current structure. Okay, great. So the next thing is we'll transition to talking about the alternatives on page 52. So here we're presenting three alternatives, and we presented them in a continuum of active risk or tracking error. And we use these two terms synonymously here, but they refer to the same thing. So as you move from left to right, you start to see lower degrees of tracking error. On the left-hand side, we show you your current structure. So a quick recap, 6 managers total, 2 value, 2 growth, 1 emerging markets, and 1 small cap. And we've listed the reasoning behind each of these structures down below. And so for the current structure, the philosophy here is that active management pays across all international equity markets. And recall that first page we showed you about the active management, we could see that this is consistent with the historical results. Alternative 1 to the right of that is a streamlined structure. So instead of 2 value and 2 growth, we have 1 value and 1 growth. We still maintain 100% active management, but similar to the US equity structure, we wanted to provide an option where you simplify. So here you're going from 6 managers down to 4. Alternative 2 reduces tracking error. So here we're introducing an index fund to complement 1 value and 1 growth manager. And so because of introducing the index fund, you start to see some potential fee savings here as well. Alternative 3 is a more extreme option. So this reduces tracking error the most, and it reduces fees the most. And here you can see that the 4 managers are replaced by 1 single index fund. So on the next page, we have the numbers that go with these structures. So the table at the top shows the weights to each of the managers for the alternatives. And the table at the bottom shows some important summary statistics for the alternatives. I won't read through all the numbers here, but I just want to point out what's being accomplished here in the alternatives in terms of lower risk and lower tracking error. If you look at the table at the bottom, focusing on standard deviation or total risk, you can see that the current structure has about 15% standard deviation annualized. And if you choose to adopt alternatives 1, 2, or 3, you can see that that risk goes down to around 14%. Tracking error as well goes down. So right now you're at about 2.8% annualized. And alternative 1 has 2.3. Alternatives 2 and 3 are below 2. So the intuition behind these 3 alternatives is that as you move from left to right, you're simplifying or you're decreasing active risk or overall risk, but that comes at the cost of potentially leaving some alpha on the table. And that comes at a pretty significant disruption, especially alternative 3, where you're basically removing 4 managers and replacing them with 1 index fund. So that comes at pretty significant disruption. And those are some of the main reasons why we don't see a real compelling reason to move to any of these alternatives. We think where your position is reasonable, but we just wanted to give you some options. So I think I'll stop here on this page. The next section shows us some more analysis on the alternatives, but the gist of the analysis is that all of the alternatives have similar exposures to your benchmark and similar exposures to your current structure. So I'll pause here to see if there's any reactions or questions or anything, Greg and Claire, you want to add?
Is it fair to say that the difference is, having a helmsman at the wheel of a ship or having it on autopilot?
I think that's a fair thing to say. I think tracking error, if you have an index fund, you don't have to worry so much about underperformance or overperformance, as that's going to be much lower. But if you have all active managers, especially a few of these active managers have a high level of risk, you're really depending on that helmsman to guide you through.
Yeah, I mean, the helmsman looks ahead. Autopilot just points itself in a direction and keeps going that way.
Right.
Yeah, so your autopilot would be like moving into alternative 3, Lee, where, we're just going to float along with the market. I told Callan that I did not really like these plans very much. Our portfolio is not in the worst shape. Considering what we're doing with domestic equity right now, I don't think we should be jumping into making changes quicker necessarily. I think it's really good for us to think about this, because this is going to be something that we're going to address in the next 5 years, maybe next 3 years, maybe sooner if the board really wants to do that. But considering the changes that we've made and we are now making to our domestic structure, I told Callan that I would not want to see us move forward on any of these alternatives in the near future, but that it's important for us to think about that and be aware of step 2 and step 3 as we kind of reevaluate certain portions of our portfolio.
This is Sherry. I just have one comment as far, and I agree with the recommendation. I'm not saying we should make any changes like what we're being offered here, but Oakmark, they're the highest risk, and it feels like are we being rewarded for the risk we're taking at Oakmark? It feels like they've been struggling ever since we've had them. Are they the best out there in that space?
My viewpoint is from an accounting point of view. So Greg and Claire, maybe you want to give a little insight on your opinion there.
Sure, I'll kick off. Oakmark is certainly a volatile manager. So Harris is the underlying manager of that strategy there. And they tend to be the top dot or the bottom dot. They typically, or they do have a value orientation to their style, and value has been out of favor generally. So back to that point of the ponds that they're fishing in. Now that said, they have been out of favor for a while now, so their numbers do not look good versus benchmarks. But we would expect them to come back very strongly if value does come back into favor. So their performance, again, does not track that benchmark closely at all. It's not what we would expect from their strategy. It's a pretty concentrated strategy. And it has been out of favor for some time, but again, it's consistent with what we'd expect for the strategy.
Claire, what drives value to become a popular strategy?
Well, when you break it down into sectors, into companies, into what types of companies are outperforming in the current market environment, again, that's where we're seeing that massive divergence between growth and value. Greg, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so, and I apologize, my connection got a little shaky over the past few minutes, so I hope this is coming through okay. Some people also attribute low interest rates to the favorability of growth strategies, and the idea there is if your company's growing quickly, its earnings are growing in the future. So what you earn 3 years from now is more than what you earn today. Okay, well, that's what a growth stock is. What's that have to do with interest rates? Well, as interest rates go to zero, that's what discounts future cash flows. So those things with larger future cash flows in the future go up more in value. Because in kind of from a very academic standpoint, what does it mean to have zero interest rates? It means you're kind of indifferent from getting a dollar 3 years from now from a dollar today. So those future bigger dollars are valued as if you're getting them today. That's what low interest rates mean, zero interest rates mean. So what some people say will break this cycle is once interest rates come up and people start saying, okay, actually, I kind of care if I get paid today versus I get paid in 4 years, right? And so some people think that's what's going to break the cycle. If you dig into the industries as well, energy is more value oriented. So if the price of oil goes up, that'll let value rebound. If technology companies come up over greater regulatory pressure, if they're broken up, that's going to be negative for growth. So there are a number of scenarios out there, and I just kind of mentioned a few, but those are the few of them that could impact it. The final thing I'll point out is that right now what's driving a lot of the markets is large amounts of liquidity, and if that changes, if people don't have more dollars than investment ideas, then the thing that will go down the most likely are growth stocks. So a number of hypotheticals there. So we don't pretend we know when that's going to happen, but those are some of the things that could trigger a shift in the market.
Do we foresee that shift coming anytime soon based upon what you've seen?
There's an old saying, Lee, the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent, right? You might disagree with things, but you can disagree with them for a really, really, really long time. So I don't think we don't have insight as to when this will shift, but I do, my life experience has been that looking at the tech bubble, looking at how much financials were doing well before the global financial crisis. We've seen this before, and history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. So, this will come to an end at some point. We don't know when, we don't know what the trigger is going to be. It could be 3 years from now, it could be next week.
Only one of our managers right now, today, this morning, is technically underwater, and that would be Harbor International. Some of the others are not doing as well, and then they look better artificially because we rebalanced into them in this April. But in terms of our entire international portfolio, there's only one mutual fund that is underwater today. So overall, the allocation hasn't done that poorly. In fact, it's the best, it performed best in the quarterly report this last quarter. So,
and the mutual fund was a passive manager.
None of them are. Yeah, none of them are.
So this is a whole lot of analysis to make you feel good that what you're doing is appropriate, in our opinion. And that's important. That's an important exercise to go through. But at this point, we think what you have is good. We set it up to execute on a long-term strategy, and so at this point, we think we don't have a recommended change, but we're certainly open to other points of view.
I have a question, maybe for Doris or for Robert. I see that alternative 2 and 3 reduce fees down to 0.55 or 0.43 and reduce the number of managers. Any thoughts on alternatives 2 and 3?
Yeah, let me jump in. Alternative 2, I don't like. I don't necessarily like the idea of giving Investec more money, and then I also don't necessarily like the idea of going to the core index. I do like the fees, no doubt about that, and it's nice that we're lowering our standard deviation by a full point, but moving into alternative 3, essentially, we're going to be riding the wave of the indexes, and it's hard to say if that's going to benefit us more or less than the last 4 years are. But it's very hard to judge a project in a 4-year time frame. So my tendency would be want to be conservative on this and think about those changes that we want, but not necessarily consider implementing them until we finish some of the infrastructure and the domestic equity changes, just so there's less moving parts floating around when we go to try and compare. So I like the idea of fees, but I don't necessarily like the idea of putting the money into the indexes.
And if I could add on to what Robert had to say, I think part of the fundamental question comes down to whether or not you feel the international market as a whole is enough to benefit from a large allocation to an index fund. The international market or certain segments of it, like the smaller cap international, make active management attractive. Certainly with the US domestic market, there was a lot of evidence to suggest that our active management dollars weren't really doing us much in the large cap, and we reallocated to have active management only in the small cap side. Here, you're looking at options that would either take you from all active management on the international side to virtually all indexed down to your alternative 3. And I think it comes down to a fundamental question of how efficient you think those international markets are, and maybe Greg or someone would like to care to comment on that.
Yeah, so when we look at the international markets, Gary kind of showed some data on this. The average manager tends to outperform. So if we just pick the average manager out there, we're going to be ahead net of fees. And importantly, if all of our managers equal the average manager. So one could lose, one could win. We want all of them to do, to pull us up. If in investing, I've mentioned this, I think, to the group a few times. If you get 2/3 of your decisions right, you're going to do really well. We think the average manager is going to do well here. So we're willing to take that bet. We're willing to bet that we can beat the market by using active managers here. Now, one real point of clarification, we're not trying to pick the average manager. We want our managers, we hope, are above average. But just in the decision of active versus passive, that data that shows that, the average does pretty good, that's the basis for our recommendation there.
Dan, did you have a comment?
I just was wondering if another way of putting it would be if for a index fund or a market to be efficient, is that sort of dependent upon transparency and information about those businesses, and no sleight of hand going on in terms of what a business is really doing and their profit margins, and that we assume that there's transparency in the U.S. Stock market, but that maybe it's not entirely the case in every single international market. Is that kind of the basic premise?
Yeah, so that's a great point, Dan. So why are international markets less efficient than U.S. markets? So there are a few theories there. So what you're alluding to is there an informational advantage that one could have in different markets? If I have better information to act on, can I work in those markets and add value that way? That's in large part why international and U.S. small cap tends to exhibit more alpha. On top of that, you could argue that there are non-economic buyers across the globe. So what I mean by that is people might be buying a stock, driving up its price, or ignoring a stock, driving down its price for non-economic reasons. So they might not be able to buy it, or they might be over enthusiastic in buying it for one reason or the other. I mean, we could talk about the market in China is driven by retail investors. You could talk about insurance companies who have certain requirements to buy types of securities no matter what. You could talk about central governments acting in a way. They act in a non-economic manner, and that creates inefficiencies that managers can go and exploit. So those are kind of a couple of the big reasons that we think that international markets are less efficient than U.S. large cap markets.
Well, this is Richard. I, for one, appreciate the report. I hear the recommendation from the Callan folks and from Robert. And it looks to me like it's a mini diversification here in this category that if things move around, we might do well in. So I don't think we should change anything.
I'm wondering, is there a motion to keep the international equity structure as is?
I don't know they need a motion to keep it the same.
Okay.
I would suggest we just watch it.
I'm sorry.
Madam Chair, this is Quincy.
Quincy, yes.
Again, what I keep hearing, and to use two contractions in one sentence, it's if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But at the end of the day, I am still curious on some input from Robert on alternative 1. I understood his reasoning to Mr. Jurdy on alternative 2 and 3, why he didn't like adding more money to Investec. Alternative 1 obviously is not adding core, but it's more streamlining the other, going from 2 international value and 2 national growth. I'm not in any condition or situation where I feel like we should be changing this. I'm just curious on Robert's input on why he might shy away from alternative 1 if we were interested in changing.
I do like alternative 1 the most, for sure. T. Rowe Price has performed well. I mean, we kind of have the same problem here with the growth value managers that we're kind of having in the domestic equity. You know, the growth is doing really well for the most part. The value is dogging. And so in terms of alternative 1 specifically, I'd love to give Euro Pacific more money. Mondrian, you'd have to really twist my arm to give them more money outside of a rebalance. Those are the 2 main reasons. So I'm kind of conflicted. On the one hand, you know, putting money into Euro Pacific could be a really good long-term move. They're a really strong, they're a very strong fund. Mondrian is not as strong, but they're totally value tilted. So
I appreciate that. I think that the reason it's curious to me is because it does reduce that standard deviation almost the same as the other alternatives without some of the other drawbacks that it sounds like, or reservations you have. So I'm not interested in changing our plan. I was just curious because that does have essentially the same result on the standard deviation.
Yeah, alternative 1, in my view, would be the best one to actually move into here. So one other thing I didn't mention on alternative 2, Investec and Mondrian have some very similar geographical overlaps. You know, specifically Japan, Germany, and Britain. And so that's kind of another little reason why I might want to shy away from 2. Just sometimes when I'm reviewing the holding reports of those 2, I'm thinking, you know, I don't know. These guys got some of the same companies. Yeah, they're in different weights, but they're in the same countries. And, you know, some of their holdings are the same. So I'm not sure that alternative 2 is really going to provide the diversification geographically that we already basically have, that we have now. I have a hard time reconciling getting rid of the growth and value developed non-US because Mondrian has some developed non-US quite a bit too. And even Investec does.
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate it.
So are we all interested in retaining the current structure, or is there anyone besides Robert who feels that we should move to one of the alternatives?
If there's no action, this could just be a receive and file, Madam Chair.
Okay, that's what we'll do then. And is there any further discussion?
With appreciation for all this fine work.
Yes.
Callum's working hard for us.
All righty. Well,
you too as well, Robert. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you all.
Thanks, all.
And Claire.
Thank you, Claire.
Okay, well, thanks, everyone. I think that's all we have on our agenda. Anything else before we let you move on with your day?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, so good to see you all. Looking forward to the day when we can see each other in person again.
Well, then you'll have to drive.
Hey, you know what? If I leave these 4 walls, I'll be happy.
Thank you.
All right, thank
Okay.
you, guys.
Good seeing you all. Bye-bye.
Good to see you. Thanks.
Bye-bye. So Moving on to the State Street Bank and Trust Company for custodial banking services. Is that your area, Robert, or is it Doris and Robert? I'm not sure.
Well, I wrote the memo, so I could at least introduce it. Yeah, so before you've got the State Street contract extension. It's a 3-year extension. We've been pretty happy with State Street. I tried to explain in the last paragraph without getting preachy about why State Street is a good custodian for us, which basically, you know, they're so large that they have worked into their whole platform current security protocols for trading, wires, reporting, and they've also got a large umbrella of investment managers that are available to them. So those are the primary reasons why, you know, I wouldn't recommend changing anything, because we're going to need them. We're going to need them over the next couple of years, no doubt, as we add infrastructure and possibly make any other kind of changes in the future. They just provide a lot of flexibility for us. On top of that, the contract is a little bit cheaper. They removed some of their monthly maintenance reporting fees. They kept a lot of their fees exactly the same. The net asset value charge is going to be the same. All the wire costs are all the same. All the costs for class action filing, all that's all the same. So essentially, they're just lowering our monthly, you know, administration expense in this contract. There are a number of individual line item changes that I tried to go over in the memo. Did anybody have any questions about any of those items at all? I figured maybe somebody might get a little freaked out because of item number 2. But don't worry. We do have a separate form and agreement that covers the exact transmission method and control for all the sales and purchases of wires and securities. Item number 3, they add a bankruptcy clause. It's pretty unlikely that one of the largest money managers in the world as of last year goes bankrupt. Could happen, but you know, seems unlikely. Item number 4, they are changing their internal workers' comp coverage. They're just lowering it down a little bit. It doesn't affect us. That's all related towards the people that work for State Street. And they have also added an explicit separate agreement for class action filing. So we've had that since we've been with them in 2015. And we'll typically get, you know, a few emails each year from State Street that go over different types of class action lawsuits. And so we are already using that service. We receive those reports at this time already. Those are essentially free until we actually file a claim and request State Street to do that. So in terms of that filing service, nothing has changed. They're just kind of separating it out and defining the terms a little bit more. I believe that that is it. Did anybody have any questions about any of the items or concerns?
Robert, I'm wondering, do you have direct access to our managers what like their net asset value is on a daily basis? And if so, is that true, State Street?
Yes and no. I do have access to almost all the managers' daily updates. No, it's not through State Street all the time. So yeah, sometimes yes. Almost every single manager sends some kind of daily updates. We don't get daily NAVs from T Rowe and we don't get daily NAVs from Mondrian because they're monthly NAV funds. So besides those two funds, and in our real estate funds, everything else we get daily.
But those daily figures are available on the State Street site also. It's just you're also getting that information directly from the manager.
There's a timing issue between, of a day or 2 days between those reports, yeah. But typically 2 days after any given day, I can verify those numbers in State Street.
Is there a motion to approve the State Street contract as presented?
Madam Chair, so moved.
For a second?
Second.
Is there any further discussion? Tim? Tim, did you?
No, I was for seconding the motion.
Oh, okay.
I have one question. Have we ever considered Northern Trust?
Yes, they were one of the 3 folks that put in RFPs in 2015.
Because I have clients who switched from State Street to Northern Trust and are very happy they did it.
Gotcha. I was not here at that time during that RFP, but they were definitely one of those folks. Maybe somebody on the board can give us some insight if they happen to remember.
I was just curious.
Any further discussion? Okay, we're going to do a roll call. Judy, would you please do the roll call? All those in favor?
Ms. Schattmeyer?
Yes.
Ms. Forrester?
Yes.
Ms. Cavanis?
Yes.
Mr. Parker?
Yes.
Ms. Smith?
Yes.
Mr. Cromer?
Aye.
Mr. Knudsen?
Yes.
Ms. Harris? I think she's muted. Ms. Harris?
I said aye, I'm sorry.
Thank you. 30.
Yes.
Approved.
Okay, motion passes. We're moving on to our consent agenda. Are there any items that require discussion, or are we just gonna all approve and go forward to the administrative report?
Somebody needs to mute.
I'm not sure who that is.
CEO Rentschler, would you like to do the administrative report?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Brief update. We have a new staff person, Alex Templeton, joined us as the extra help staff assistant starting earlier this week on November 2nd. Also, in regards to our previous discussions on phone services, we are in the process of looking to move to a VoIP service that IS referred us to through Telcom, which will give us much greater flexibility in receiving phone calls and messages. That's the end of the report, unless there's any questions from trustees.
Catherine, I think you're muted.
Okay, Is there any board member discussion? Is anyone signed up for the SACRS conference next week? Oh, Richard, and I think Jerry said she had some educational requirements to fulfill. And I've been looking at the agendas for the days, and it looks pretty interesting. And they're the trustee breakout looks interesting. So if anyone's interested, I'll give you a report on it after the conference. Hi, Jerry.
Hi. Yes, I'm signed up for SACRS.
Okay, so Jerry and Richard, I'll see you next week. Okay. Yeah, it's a little odd, but you know, the part that I like about Zoom conferences is that we don't have to drive or fly very far.
Yep.
Doesn't disrupt our daily workflow either if we're still working.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Item number 10 on the agenda is the proclamation honoring Trustee Knudsen. Did you want to take care of that one?
I wanted to do that one for last, and yes, please. Yes, let's go forward and honor Tim Knudsen. We'll be very sorry that you're leaving, but such is life. So
Madam Chair, if I can, I would like to thank Tim for the many years of service to our county and to our country as well with your military service. And it's been an honor and a privilege to serve with you on this board. Thank you, sir.
So I'm going to go ahead and read the proclamation honoring Tim Knudsen for his service to the Mendocino County Employee Retirement Association and the Board of Retirement. Whereas Tim has served as a member of the board representing retirement members since retiring from county employment in 2007. After many years of dedicated service, Tim is finally planning on enjoying his retirement to the fullest. And whereas meeting participation has been one of Tim's highest priorities, resulting in one of the best attendance records of any board member over the past 20 years. And whereas Tim helped guide MSERA through independence while assisting the board in making many important operational and financial decisions along the way, greatly contributing to what MSERA is today. And his experience in finance, accounting, and investment has been an invaluable asset to MSERA, assisting in growing the fund from approximately $350 million to over $180 million during his tenure. And whereas Tim's many contributions are evident in his service as retirement administrator, trustee, and board secretary, and audit committee member and chair, his accomplishments include resolving retiree health insurance and excess earnings issues, successful pursuit of 2 favorable International Revenue Service determination letters, successful procurement and implementation of pension gold, document imaging, and member direct, and participating in the strategic plan, board work plan, and policy development and adoption. Now therefore, be it resolved that Mendocino County Board of Retirement recognizes and honors Tim Knudsen for his service and expresses a heartfelt wish that Tim, along with his wife Julie, enjoy many more years of retirement together. May they enjoy more time with family, friends, and their beloved 4-legged companions. Thank you.
You're here.
Probably should clarify, some of our companions only have 3 legs, but I did want to say I've been doing this since 1991, off and on, a little bit off, but mostly on. And when I started, the assets of the system were somewhere between 20 and $30 million. And to see it have grown to $500 million was really something. A lot of things happened in that time, pension obligation bonds, that helped. I was thinking today when the actuaries were making their presentation and we're paying the county's paying so much interest to fund the unfunded liability over a certain number of years, maybe a pension obligation bond makes sense. Dan? Just a thought. Anyway, as I move on, I've enjoyed working with all of you, and I feel confident with all the board members, and I'm very happy to see Jim come back onto the board. I almost was going to tune in to one of the presentations so I could see Richard vote.
To that issue, Tim, I've been, I think it's 11 years here, maybe it's 7. All I know is I think I've gotten to vote at one meeting in that whole time.
I think I took a break once and you stepped up.
Yeah.
Hey, this is Sherry, and I think that was the layering meeting where we put the layering in a decade ago. I don't know if that was it, but I kind of remember you vaguely voting on that. But anyway, I'm going to miss Tim so much. He was my boss for 16 years. I've been on this board with him for 14 years, so 30 years. I'm going to miss seeing you every month, even if it's like this. But I hopefully will see you around town. And thank you for everything that you've done for me and for all of us.
Thanks.
One other thing I'll throw in there is Tim actually has been really active with the Retirees Association, super active there as well. So not just here in the board sense of managing this operation, but with keeping his contact with the retired members of the organization and helping plan their functions and do newsletters. And so thanks, Tim, very much for doing everything you've done.
You're welcome. I have also stepped away from that. In fact, Jim took over some of the things I was doing with AMCRE. He's representative to CRCEA still?
I am, yeah. And if I may, I know I'm speaking from the public at this point, but Tim literally was my supervisor my first day on the county 33 years ago. And so in the auditor's office and when I was in the administrative office, through the retirement system, we've just spent a lot of wonderful years together, and Tim's just been a joy to work with and just a great partner in everything we've done.
I used to joke, when you think of Jim Anderson, remember, I taught him everything he knows.
Well, we're very fortunate to have Jim Anderson on our board. That'll be very nice too, especially since a lot of everything he knows.
Thank you
very much.
Yeah. Maybe we could get you an emeritus ticket to the Callan Institute next year if they have it. I know you really enjoyed that annual meeting at the Grand Hotel.
Oh, by Zoom.
By Zoom? Hopefully not by Zoom.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Tim.
I'll think of you when I vote.
There you go.
You can call me anytime.
We do have an audit committee meeting later this month. And so
I have to go now.
Tim does get to participate in that meeting. So.
Well, that'd be nice.
One more time.
One more.
Okay, well, great. We get you for one more meeting. Well, I guess, would anyone like to make a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So moved.
Okay. The meeting is adjourned.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Take care. Bye.